practice wishing for the object of your metta that these things happen to them. So you'll repeat this thought. May this person be happy. May this person be free. And may this person be at peace. So what we want to do is cultivate a capacity for kindness. So, close your eyes. Take a few moments to breathe in and breathe out. But I would say on a deeper level, it's more like when we say work on yourself. That involves all kinds of things about moving your life forward. And they struggle with
motivation in these things.
It's because when I don't think I'm worth it, I'm not worth fixing.
when you develop empathy and compassion for other people, there's going to be room for someone else in the relationship. And then this in turn is going to reduce the feeling of being an object. Now two people can connect. And now it's not about getting your needs met and starvation. It's about two human beings forming a relationship.
Alrighty, chat. Let's get started. Sorry for being a little bit late today. We are doing a deep dive into C-PTSD. And I found some really interesting research over the last 24 hours that took me a little bit of time to incorporate. So it took a little bit longer, and I was just prepping everything so that once we get started, I won't be stumbling around trying to find stuff. So today, we are... Speaking of stumbling around, today we are stumbling around. No. So today we are going to be doing a deep dive into C-PTSD. Just a reminder that although I'm a psychiatrist, nothing we discuss on stream today is intended to be taken as medical advice. Everything is for educational and entertainment purposes only. If y'all have a concern or question, please go see a licensed professional. This is especially important as we're talking about today because, oh my God, quiet, you. This is very important today because today we are going to be talking about clinical stuff, right? So this is not a substitute for clinical treatment. The goal of what we try to do here on stream is to educate people. And if y'all resonate with some of the stuff that we're talking about, I highly recommend that you go see a clinical professional. We're going to talk a little bit about evidence-based treatment for C-PTSD at the end of the deep dive. And yeah, so... today we're doing a deep dive into C-PTSD, and then the other thing that we're going to do today, actually, just as an FYI, so we're going to start with this. So I know that oftentimes people will want us to do things at HG, so I want to show you all something. So, uh-oh. Hold on. Fail. There, works. Okay. So you'll notice that someone made a post about a year ago. When is Dr. K going to make a comprehensive or even short video on C-PTSD? Or does he have one that I already missed? So, and then can Dr. K make a video on C-PTSD? These are both from 1 year ago. These are just the two posts that we found that were about a year old, but people have been asking this for a while. So the first thing that I want to say is that when y'all ask for stuff like this, we pay attention. It just takes a while to do, right? So like between someone posting this and actually like building it, sometimes we have faster turnaround times, but many times like it takes a while. So we're paying attention to everyone's requests. I saw a post a couple days ago that I responded to from someone sort of saying like, hey, HG feels like a boys club, is it? And yeah, we get that it feels that way sometimes, but we have a lot of great content coming out for women. There's certain challenges to that. So I know sometimes like on the internet, we're getting used to instant gratification and some kind of response, but we do pay attention to this stuff. and we add this stuff to the list, which is very large, and then we get around to it when we can. So since this thing got posted, in addition to this deep dive, which we're going to do today, we also built a whole trauma module. So this is about, it basically takes about as long to build a module as it does to write a book. The scripting for the module is about 50 to 80,000 words, a nonfiction book. So the book that I wrote is somewhere around 80,000 words. So like we built a guide. I'll show you all just real quick. So like the other cool thing is that guides are getting more complicated. So like the cool thing about a guide is that we can add a lot of other stuff, right? So we're trying to build like graphics and stuff like that, that help emphasize like the understanding of the principles at play, right? So we teach a lot of science, and sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words. And thankfully we have a whole team here at HG that helps us make pictures. So these are the trauma guide graphics that we're building. So I know this sounds like this seems like kind of overwhelming, but I guarantee you that when I talk about the neuroscience and explain the neuroscience, like this is going to help people actually understand, right? So we teach a lot of in-depth neuroscience in the guide. So this is the temporoparietal junction. So we're going to talk about this, like, just so you all know something cool. If you electrically stimulate the temporoparietal junction, you can trigger an out-of-body experience. Super cool. Don't go trying that at home, kids. So, just as we're teaching some of these, like, so here's the challenge, is like neuroscience can help us a lot, right? So in the same way that we can understand things like how muscles build and like taking creatine and exercising, and we want to do some number of reps, there's a bunch of exercise physiology, which has been demystified and made available to human beings. The challenge is that we have a ton of neuroscience that has not been demystified and made available. Instead, what we try to do is like translate things into layman's terms and then try to make it somewhat accessible through like publications like HBR and stuff like that, right? Where we'll have some pop neuroscience where they'll say like, hey, this one trick will transform your life. Like we do that stuff too. So especially in the guide, we try to really like teach all this stuff, because I think that when I work with my patients, I actually teach them all of these things, or not, I mean, not everything, but as much as I can about how their physiology works, because that'll help you a lot, especially with trauma. So there's a bunch of different stuff that we've got going on. We're building things for y'all, and super excited about it. The guide, I think, comes out soon. And so what we're going to do today is actually watch one video of the guide after the deep dive. So we're going to do a deep dive into C-PTSD. Then we're going to show you all a video from the guide just to illustrate something, because it's explained in there, and I think it's a cool video. And then we're going to get to Q&A. Okay? Let's see if anyone has questions before we begin. I'm going to just check in with chat. Okay. Will you ever talk? Yeah, we've talked about schizophrenia before, but we'll talk about it again for sure. We're actually working on something where we may get into schizophrenia soon, actually. Okay. Yeah, so as mods are telling y'all, the guide video that we're going to be showing y'all today is not the final cut. It's still in like post, so we're just going to be sharing it with y'all today. This will be, by the way, this stream is going to be available. Okay, so it, like I think it just stays on our various channels. Okay. Okay, so we're all traumatized. So that's a great way to start. So today we're going to be talking about complex PTSD. And the reason that I think this is really important to talk about is because it's my belief that features of PTSD are present in large percentages of the population without being a full-blown diagnosis. Now, let me explain what the hell that means. So if we look at the epidemiology, the prevalence of PTSD is about 1.5%. So 1.5% of human beings on the planet have post-traumatic stress disorder. about 0.5% or about a third of those people have something called complex PTSD, and we'll get to what that is. So the interesting thing is if you look at what separates PTSD and CPTSD, if you remove the PTSD component, what is left over, I think, is actually quite common in our society today. That's why, despite the fact that only 1 out of 200 people has a diagnosis of CPTSD, it is my firm belief that understanding that component will be very helpful to a lot of the people in our community and in the world. So for me, for example, when I work with people who have other diagnoses like major depressive disorder or addictions especially, what I've found is that the more that I learned about CPTSD, the more effective of a clinician I became at treating these people. So that's why we're kind of diving into it today. And as I think a large portion of our community and people today resonate with some of the features of CPTSD. So let's start with a little bit of history. So the first thing is, like, what are these diagnoses and where do they come from? So a couple, maybe about 80 years ago, soldiers came back from war. And what doctors noticed was that these soldiers, like, weren't all there. So they seem to have, like, this brain fog. They have difficulty concentrating. They're, like, having, like, emotional problems. They drink more. They can't incorporate back into society. So the first round of doctors said, oh, this is something called shell shock. And so what they thought happened is that even though this person doesn't have an actual physical injury, the concussive blast of an explosion must have hit their brain in some way and caused damage. So, okay, the original form of PTSD was born, and we called it shell-shocked. It's because a bomb went off like very close to you. You didn't actually get hurt. But there was some kind of vibration or concussive blast that affected your brain. That's the injury. It's not like shrapnel or anything like that. So no bleeding, but an internal injury. So then what happened is, as we started to, like, work with veterans more and more and more, we started to realize that this is happening to a lot of people that, like, weren't in the concussive blast zone. So they, like, saw one of their friends die or something like that. They were only on the field of battle for like a day, and they just, like, retreated, but still they saw someone die. And then these people had the symptoms of shell shock. So shell shock started with, like, concussive blast. And then we noticed that people have these symptoms, but haven't experienced concussive blasts. This is where PTSD was born. So PTSD is usually an adaptation or a maladaptation of the body to an acute, specific traumatic event. In its original form, PTSD was primarily found in soldiers. So seeing a friend die or something like that results in PTSD. Then what happened is, once we had this construct, once we had these, like, diagnostic criteria and stuff, clinicians made a really interesting observation. We see this kind of PTSD or shell shock, whatever phenomenon, in people who have never been in combat. And they're like, what on earth? They have all the same symptoms, but they've never been in combat. Then we expanded PTSD to being non-combat related things like sexual trauma or physical abuse, or even things like bullying and stuff like that. So the web of the scope of PTSD grew. We'll talk about what it is in a second. Then what happened is a group of researchers noticed that some people with PTSD have a different flavor to it and have different kinds of symptoms. And they noticed something really important, that if the trauma is chronic, if it is consistent over time, that results in a different clinical picture. And this is where complex PTSD was born. So if we look at regular PTSD, here's the way that I understand it, okay? So first of all, it has 3 core features. So one is re-experiencing, the second is avoidance, and the third is, I'm blanking, I can't believe I'm blanking on this. So there's lots of diagnostic criteria, but they get lumped into 3 things: re-experiencing, avoidance, hypervigilance, maybe. Hold on, I will figure this out. Give me a second, chat. The joys of a Vata memory. Okay. Oh, hypervigilance. Hyperarousal is the word that they use. Okay. So basically, PTSD has 3 core clusters of symptoms: hypervigilance or hyperarousal, re-experiencing, and avoidance. So let's understand what PTSD is. So we start off with a human being who is relatively well-formed and healthy. And then some kind of traumatic event happens to them. And then their physiology, their brain, their being adapts to try to survive that thing. The problem is the way that we adapt to survive that one instance creates maladaptations or problems going forward. So let's use a very simple example. So let's say that I end up in a car crash, right? So I'm a relatively healthy person. I'm in my mid-20s and I get into a car accident. So once I get into a car accident, there is a hyperactivation of my nervous system, my autonomic nervous system. So I have adrenaline pumping through my body. I have cortisol getting flushed into my body. And then my brain is being hyperactive. I'm hyperventilating. I get taken to the hospital. And then I end up being okay. Now, the problem is that our brain has evolved to adapt. So a human being can adapt to circumstances. And what the brain does is says, hey, we almost died there. Let's be extra, extra, extra careful and make sure that never happens again. So this is where what we see in PTSD is, first of all, people will have, and then other things happen. We'll get into this in more detail. But other things happen that will kind of numb out our brain. And so then what happens is all of these experiences get dissociated. They they're dormant in our subconscious, and then they will arise again. So people will have flashbacks. They will have nightmares. These are both diagnostic features, but this is what we call re-experiencing. Even though the event is over, a part of their mind gets stuck in that moment. And that part of their mind will arise and fall over time. So the second thing that happens is people have avoidance, right? So now our brain, remember, our brain is designed to help us and keep us alive. So for example, if I almost drown in a lake, anytime I see a body of water, I will get scared and my brain will tell me, don't go near the water, don't go near the water, don't go near the water. Right? And you'll understand this if you've played video games, especially multiplayer video games, where you play a video game once and then you have a really bad game because your teammates are feeding, and then your brain is like, never again, never again, never again. And the thought of playing the game makes you hyperventilate and nauseous, which is why most people play multiplayer games for about 5 to 10 hours over the course of their lifetime, because they get so traumatized that they never come back, right? Same thing. Y'all should be familiar with that phenomenon. So, it'd be interesting. I wonder if we could explore the mechanism through which people keep going back to video games that are consistently traumatic as a way to desensitize people with PTSD and actually get them to re-engage in life. That's really interesting. I never thought about that before. But I actually wonder why are video games so traumatic, but we keep going back? That's really interesting. Anyway, conversation for a different day. So in PTSD, you have a solo event. You have re-experiencing of it. You have avoidance of whatever it is. So people will avoid getting into a car again. And the third thing that you have is hyperarousal. So what happens in our brain, in our physiology, is that we wire differently. So I don't know if this kind of makes sense, but if I get attacked by something, my brain will be more sensitive to detecting it in the future. And I will be more, my response to that stimulus will be a lot more robust. So let's say I get attacked by a dog on the street. The next time I see a dog, first of all, my brain will be able to pick out dogs out of a field of people. If I'm walking down the street and there's 100 people in the park across the street, my brain will notice if there's a single dog, and it'll raise that to my awareness. And then the moment that I see a dog, my physiology will activate. It will go back to being attacked. So I'll see a rush of adrenaline and cortisol. So these are the features of PTSD. Basically, I'm a normal person. I have a traumatic event, and then these three things activate. Now, then what happened is people noticed that, okay, so this is a fundamentally different picture from when we have complex PTSD, which is consistent trauma over time. So what happens when you have, let's say, a teenager living at home who has an emotionally and physically abusive parent? So this is the kind of thing where, it's not a single event. This is the kind of thing where it's not our body and brain are just adapting over the course of one day. This is a chronic form of abuse or trauma that results in a far larger scale change to our sense of self even. So what we see is in complex PTSD, we have a cluster of 3 symptoms, which are referred to as a disorganized self, okay? So this involves, first of all, emotional dysregulation, a loss of your sense of identity, and a difficulty with relationships. Now, you can see features of these things in regular PTSD. Let's actually start drawing. So now we'll talk about it. Easier if I... Disturbances in self-organization. Okay, so let's take a look. Chat. All right. So here is a person. Okay? And if they have one traumatic event, but they are relatively well formed. So what this means is they have a relatively normal life. This results or can result in PTSD, and this has re-experiencing. Avoidance and hyperarousal. And we'll get into all these, okay? Now, let's say that the trauma is chronic. So then what happens is that this person is not usually well formed. So it changes their sense of self. And this is what we call disturbances in self-organization. So if you kind of look at those are the way I understand it. If you have PTSD, PTSD is happening to you. This is an adaptation, but you are sort of separate from the traumatic event. When the trauma is more constant, and when it happens earlier, so we'll get to this in a second in a little bit more detail, it changes who you are. It changes, so it's not something that happens to you. The trauma becomes a part of you. So this is what disturbances in self-organization mean. So what this means is that there's emotional dysregulation. There is disturbances in a sense of identity, and there are difficulties in relationships. Okay, so let's take a quick look at something else. So I think this. So, predictors of complex PTSD, the role of trauma characteristics, dissociation, and comorbid psychopathology. So, findings largely confirm earlier research suggesting that C-PTSD is associated with traumatic events that start earlier in life and are perpetrated by acquaintances. Okay? So if we look at C-PTSD, how is this different? What this means is that, remember, we're well formed in PTSD. So we have like a random, like if I get mugged by a random person, I can get PTSD. But I have no relationship with that person. What leads to C-PTSD is, first of all, it happens earlier, so our sense of self is not well crafted. And furthermore, it oftentimes relates to having someone that is close to us in life. So our sense of self really gets messed up when our parents are abusive. And that results in this symptom cluster, okay? Now let's take a second to look at the original paper on C-PTSD. And by the way, if you guys want to read about trauma, the two references I would recommend is this one. So Judith Herman was the one who coined the term. And this is an excellent paper. Excellent, excellent, excellent paper. Okay? So we're going to just quickly look at this. The current diagnostic formulation of PTSD derives primarily from observations of survivors of relatively circumscribed traumatic events, right? So she's saying basically PTSD is talking about, it relates to people who have single events or circumscribed. So you can draw a circle around them. This formulation fails to capture the protean sequelae of prolonged, repeated trauma. So now Dr. Herman is saying this is a different thing if the trauma happens all the time. In contrast to a single traumatic event, prolonged, repeated trauma can occur only where the victim is in a state of captivity under the control of the perpetrator. The psychological impact of subordination to coercive control has many common features, whether it occurs within the public sphere of politics or within the private sphere of sexual and domestic relations. So what Dr. Herman basically noticed is that we have a group of people who are put in situations where they no longer have control over their life. And this has a different kind of effect on the psyche. Right? So like if I get into a car accident, that doesn't fundamentally change like what I'm capable of doing tomorrow. So Dr. Herman was looking a lot at people like prisoners of war, where these people this isn't just a single, military conflict on a single day. This is someone who day after day is abused, and it changes the way that they function. So today we're going to be talking about that. Since then, things have evolved a lot. By the way, the other reference on trauma that I would highly recommend, we're just going to flash to it real quick, is this. So The Body Keeps the Score is a great book on trauma, but I think y'all can get a lot of this summarized in Bessel van der Kolk's awesome paper from Dialogues in Clinical Neuroscience. So this talks a lot about stuff. Dr. K, 2024. Okay? So now what we're going to do is dig into what happens in trauma. So when we built this trauma guide, what we basically have, so we did a trauma workshop a couple months ago, maybe about a year ago now. And the trauma workshop was like incredibly successful. So like basically there were 200 spots. It sold out in 24 hours. And then we increased it to 250 spots. And so a lot of people were super confused, like, hey, like, are you going to do this again? Why aren't you doing it again? We realized that the demand was so high and there's no way that we can get to everyone that we actually decided to just build a guide instead. So we took the trauma workshop, which was about 8 or 9 hours, and we expanded it to like 15, 16 hours of stuff. I think maybe that's less. I don't know what the actual video size is, but we built this guide. And the guide also has meditations and exercises and stuff like that. So today what we're going to go through is some of the core features that we explain in the guide. Obviously, they're in more detail there. And we're going to focus on the features of complex PTSD. So let's try to understand what happens in trauma. Okay? Now, so we're going to start with the body. So the first thing that happens when we get traumatized is we get hyperarousal. Okay? So our nervous system changes. Our nervous system changes to be jittery. So what does this mean? This means I'm walking along and I see oh God, I can't draw a dog. Okay, I see a dog. And normally, like when I see a dog, I don't have a robust physiologic response. But once I have PTSD, what starts to happen is even benign stimuli will trigger a very strong sympathetic nervous system response. So we have this part of our nervous system called the autonomic nervous system, or ANS. And the autonomic nervous system is divided into the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay? So the sympathetic nervous system governs fight or flight. The parasympathetic nervous system governs rest and digest. And the simplest way to understand that is, when I was in college, I used to talk to my friends. We used to have this phrase called being owned. And it's like, I just ate this gigantic sandwich. I am now owned. I can't do anything. I am GG'd. GG. And there are other times before you eat a gigantic sandwich where you feel active, you feel energetic, you feel like optimistic about the future, whatever. So our body has periods of activity and then it has periods of rest and digest. So I don't know if you guys like, after you have a meal, what happens is our parasympathetic nervous system activates. So when the parasympathetic nervous system activates, and it's triggered by things like food in your stomach, And then our body sends, so our stomach sends signals to our brain that's like, hey, we've got a bunch of food coming in. We need to divert blood flow from our skeletal muscles, like our arms and our legs and our brain, to our digestive system. Our liver needs blood, our GI system needs blood, our stomach needs blood, intestines need blood, our gallbladder needs blood. This is where we need all of our blood flow. So we'll feel sleepy. We'll feel like sitting around, we'll digest things. And then there are other times, like when I'm walking down the street and I get attacked by a thief, so if someone's trying to mug me, then my sympathetic nervous system will activate. I'll get a surge of adrenaline and cortisol, and then I will fight or I will run away. Now, if we look at diseases like anxiety disorders or panic attacks, what we see is that in these disorders, we have a hyperactivation of the sympathetic nervous system. In our society today, we have a very high stress state. And the reason for that is that, generally speaking, the sympathetic nervous system was something that was supposed to turn on and off, right? So this evolved in like deer. So if you think about a deer, like a deer doesn't worry about paying mortgage at the end of the month. They don't worry about GPA. They don't worry about being alone for the rest of their life. The deer is basically chilling and then responds to its environment. If it sees like a wolf, it runs away and then it kind of calms down. So in most animals, if we look at a 30-day period, they may have an activation of sympathetic nervous system here or here. Oh, I see a deer that I'm sexually attracted to, so I get a spike of it. What happens in human beings is we get prolonged activation. Because if I have a test in 2 weeks, I don't stress about that in 2 weeks. I start stressing today and I stay stressed. So hyperarousal is basically the same thing. It is a elevated triggering of our sympathetic nervous system. So it's not chronic. It just means that, so here's the way that I would put it. So here's a normal human being. And let's say that I need a danger signal that is this high. So if my danger signal hits this point, actually, let's do this way. So let's say here's our stress response. I'm going to redo this chat because this is done wrongly. And here's our danger. So let's say danger level 1, danger level 10. Danger level 10 is like there's a tornado flying towards me. Danger level 1 is, I don't know, there's like someone rings the doorbell, let's say. So normally what happens is we need like a danger level of 7. So as we go over here, as we get a danger level of 7, then we see an increase in the stress response. So this is like for a normal human being. When you have PTSD, what we tend to find is that a danger level of 4 is sufficient to trigger a stress response. So our threshold to trigger the sympathetic nervous system goes way down. It is easy for us to get triggered, right? And we use this term so much in common language nowadays, like this triggers me, this triggers me, this triggers me, right? It's and the things that we say trigger us, I mean, all kinds of stuff can trigger us. But usually what people are referring to is that a very small dose of exposure will lead to a robust or disproportionate response. So this is the first feature. This, by the way, is very physiologic. So it has nothing to do with your mind or your feelings or stuff. I mean, that's not true, but it has a lot to do with that. But this is like at the level of biology, okay? So the second thing that we see let me think about how to think about this. So this is hyperarousal. Okay. Now, hyperarousal will result in things like avoidance. We'll kind of get to those in a little bit. But now what we're going to talk about is the second level that we're going to focus on is emotions. So the other thing that we see in PTSD is that, in complex PTSD, is that people have a tendency to dissociate. So we've explained this concept before, but it's really important to understand. So our brain has two hemispheres, the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere governs a lot of our emotions, and the left hemisphere governs a lot of our analytical capability. Now, this is an oversimplification because we also know that the dorsoparietal area and the amygdala and the limbic system, we have emotional structures on both sides of our brain. So like there's like other ways that this is not really that accurate, but it sort of is. So what van der Kolk, he's a great trauma researcher. I think this was van der Kolk's research. What he noticed is that he basically dug into how people dissociate. So what happens in trauma is that a very low threshold of exposure is necessary for a hyperactive physiologic response. So if we kind of go back to our diagram, I wonder if this is a good way to explain it. So like, I don't know if this makes sense, but like, so we can go from here to here, and then we can kind of top out. But if we look at trauma, what happens in dissociation is we can't keep going up, right? This is the max. This is the top. You can't get any more stress than that. This is maximal activation of the sympathetic nervous system. You can't just keep going up. So what van der Kolk basically noticed is that somewhere around here, I'm just sort of approximating, okay? This triggers dissociation. So the stress level is so high that our it's kind of like, you know, I can put wattage through a light bulb. I can increase the amount of watts that go through a light bulb, and the light bulb will get brighter and brighter and brighter until it burns out. So this is what happens in dissociation. Dissociation is usually triggered by a hyperactivation of the sympathetic nervous system. It's like you go all the way around the world, you're heading east, and then suddenly you end up like west of where you started, which is like really weird. So this is what happens in dissociation, is that the signals are so overwhelming, the emotions are overwhelming, the physiology is overwhelming, that it triggers this process of dissociation. Now, what happens in dissociation, a couple of different things happen, but the key thing that we're going to focus on is decreased activity across the corpus callosum. So our right hemisphere is where we experience emotions. Our left hemisphere is where we experience analysis. So as y'all know, when I get emotional, my analysis starts getting messed up. And so our brain is like, I can't handle these emotions. I can't handle, this is too much activity, too much activity, too much activity. And there's even some studies, let me see if I can find this. I don't think I have this prepped, but let me see if I can find it. Yes. Okay. So what happens, this is super cool, dude. So cool, but fucking weird. Okay. The mechanism underlying this process is understood as being analogous to kindling, which involves the emergence of generalized seizures in response to repeated subthreshold electrophysiological stimulation. In PTSD, similar to the kindling of seizures, the progressive augmentation and amplification of symptoms occurs over time, possibly as the result of neural circuitry associated with emotional memory response becoming increasingly reactive and also expanding into neighboring neural circuits. So I know that probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense to y'all, but let's explain what's going on. So basically what happens in PTSD is we almost get something like seizures, right? It's not really a seizure. But what happens is that there's an activity. So if you think about what a seizure is when you have, normally we have controlled electrical activity. So neuron turns on, second neuron turns on, first neuron turns off, second neuron turns off. This is how it works, right? So it's like I'm sending a signal and it goes from here to there and then we're done. So in a seizure, what happens is we have unregulated electrical activity across the brain. So everyone is just activating each other and activating each other and activating each other. So what people have noticed in PTSD is there is a similar thing going on, where we have this feeding and unregulated upswing of whatever badness is going on. So we have panic attacks, we have re-experiencing, we have flashbacks, we feel overwhelmed, we feel triggered, and then much like a seizure, so after you have a seizure, people have this thing called a post-ictal state, where they're not quite comatose, but they're like sort of semi-conscious, because their brain just shuts off. And so the same thing happens in PTSD, okay, or in trauma, is that you have this overactivation, and then the brain is like, enough is enough, and then we dissociate. We just completely unplug. Now, what happens in dissociation is that we have decreased activity across the corpus callosum. So the emotional center of our brain, which is going absolutely haywire, the emotional hemisphere, which is going absolutely haywire, the left side of our brain is like, enough is enough. We can't handle this. Cut off all contact with the right side of the brain. Then we dissociate. So what this feels like is you can watch terrible things happening dispassionately to yourself. The logical part of your brain is like, this is happening, now this person is hurting me, now they're hurting me more, now they're hurting me more, this is painful, period. There's no emotional connection to this experience, okay? So once we dissociate, once this process happens, and this is where I think van der Kolk coined this term, and apologies to the researchers who coined it if I'm misattributing this. We call this process hemispheric lateralization. Now, this creates all kinds of problems because once we disconnect from our emotions, we have all kinds of challenges, okay? So if we look at what is the role of emotion, so emotions do a couple of things. Emotions give us information. They give us motivation. Right? So let me give y'all an example of how they give us information. So if I walk into a room and everyone is laughing and then they suddenly go quiet and look at me, I feel weird, right? I feel uncomfortable. So like, what really happened? Like, my logical brain doesn't know, but my emotional brain is like giving me information. When someone calls and cancels on you for the third time and you feel angry, your brain is telling you something, okay? Second thing is emotions give us motivation. So what we find is that when people struggle with trauma, and this is the video that we're going to show you all today. Let me go back to this. So, right, so like the paralysis of initiative of chronic trauma combines with the apathy and helplessness of depression. So what Dr. Herman noticed was that when people have been traumatized, they become like listless. Like, these veterans come back from their POW camps and they don't feel like doing anything. They just kind of sit around, they kind of exist. They have no drive, they have no passion. And if we look at like, where does drive and passion come from? It comes from our emotions, right? Well, like, I'm not going to stand for this anymore. I want to go achieve something. I want to be the best. I want to do better. I want to be free. I want to relax. These are all emotional things. The whole problem that a lot of people see in our generation, we're talking like millennials, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, is that we're told that we should do a certain thing. So our logical brain is like, I should study for this test instead of playing a video game. But my emotional brain is not motivated to do it. I'm motivated to do something else. So emotions are a big part of motivation. And when we disconnect from our emotions, we lose information, and then we also lose motivation. But there's more at play. It turns out that when we lose our emotions, okay, we also lose our sense of identity. Now, the question is why? So let's understand what your identity is. So identity is formed through stringing together emotional events. So if I ask someone who thinks that they are a loser, and I say, what makes you a loser? Let's say there's someone who's 25 years old. So they've been on this earth for like 8,000 days, okay? Yeah, so like way more than 10,000 days. So let's say someone has been on this earth for 10,000 days. And if I ask them what makes you a loser, they're not going to look at their average experience on a day-to-day basis. That's not what makes them a loser. 8,000 out of the 10,000 days, my day was relatively normal and like nothing good happened, nothing bad happened. I was just straight chilling. What makes them a loser is the emotional moments in their life. That moment that I asked this girl out to a dance and she laughed in my face and then told the whole school about it, and then everyone made fun of me for the week before school ended. And so 7 days out of 10,000 becomes this person's identity. The flip of it is also true in terms of positive things, right? So when I ask someone, hey, like, how do you think about yourself? Then someone says, I'm a really strong person who's just trying to do good in the world. And then I ask them, like, how did you develop that identity? Like, what makes you say that? Tell me about your life. And they will tell you emotional moments in their life. Once again, it's not about the 10,000 days that they've been alive. It's not like that they ate PB&J every single day. Like, that's not a part of their identity. What makes your identity is a string of emotional experiences. This is why people who like survive cancer, like it becomes a part of their identity. Like, I am a cancer survivor, because it's an emotionally grueling experience, right? Joining the military, in my case, right? So like I failed out, and like those were very powerful emotional experiences. Getting into med school, like I remember the day that I still remember the day before Thanksgiving, I got a call from the dean of the medical school after 3 years of applying, saying that, hey, I've been accepted, and I wanted to call. I've been accepted to med school, and I wanted to call so that you weren't worried and you had a happy Thanksgiving. And then I called my dad and I called my grandmother, and it was like very joyous and tearful and things like that. And anyway, it was a very powerful moment for me. We can go into more detail if y'all want. But my point is that if we look at what makes our sense of identity, it is like strings of emotional experiences. This breakup, this marriage, the birth of this child, landing this job, surviving a shark attack, like these are the moments, getting this award. It's emotional experiences that create our sense of identity. So the moment that you start dissociating, you lose your sense of identity. Then you're simply existing. You're not living. So what we see in complex PTSD is disturbances of self-organization, and it starts with emotional dysregulation. So when your emotions are dysregulated, when you can't control them, you can't really make sense of the world, right? So like there are times where your emotions get out of control and then you end up triggering dissociation. So now it's like hyperactive emotion followed by dissociation. There's no way to make sense of that. It's just like it's like someone is like, there's a difference between like painting a painting and taking a bucket of paint, throwing it on a canvas, and then burning the canvas. This is the best analogy that I can come up with in this moment of the difference between emotional dysregulation and disorganization. There's no order to it. It's just emotions out of whack followed by unplugging the whole experience. So when we have this process, then we lose our sense of identity. And this is what we see in C-PTSD. So if we look at diseases like, or diagnoses like borderline personality disorder or narcissistic personality disorder, what we find in these diagnoses is a disturbed sense of self. So in someone with BPD, they do not have a stable sense of self. So what does this mean? So what this means is that if I'm walking down the street and someone insults me and says, hey, Dr. K, you're bad at games, their opinion of me, whatever it is, or I'm great at games. They're saying I'm the best human being on the planet and I'm so good at video games. Whatever their opinion of me is, their opinion exists out here. And my opinion of me exists in here. And as they say one thing and I say another thing, these two things conflict. So if enough people say this to me, then my sense of self will change. So if you have like this entitled little prick of a kid, how do they become entitled? Because too many times their parents or the people around them are telling them over and over, they're getting signals from the outside world, you can do whatever you want. You can do whatever you want. You can do whatever you want. So you internalize this. And on the flip side, if you get told the opposite, if you have someone who has low self-esteem because they're told you're a piece of shit, you're a piece of shit, you're a piece of shit, then that becomes internalized. So you have a stable sense of self, and then you have the outside world's opinion of you. So what happens in borderline personality disorder is that their stable sense of self disappears. It's not stably high or stably low. So remember that people like who have, let's say, a mood disorder like major depressive disorder, they may have a stably low sense of self. But in BPD, the sense of self is absent. So what that sort of means, not absent, but it's not well formed. So what that sort of means is if people are treating me well, I feel great. I am a good person if people are treating me well. And if they're treating me poorly, then I'm a shitty person. This is an unstable sense of self. And now if you sort of think a little bit about complex PTSD, PTSD, and BPD, so this is kind of where, I'm gonna try to explain this a little bit more clearly. So we know that if you have BPD, you have a unstable sense of self. Which, by the way, if y'all haven't seen our video on BPD, apparently it's really good. So like I was just like, someone told me recently that has a ton of views and we've gotten really positive feedback about it, so watch it. We've got PTSD over here with our arousal, vigilance, and avoidance. And then we have C-PTSD, which is these plus this DSO, which is disturbed self-organization. So emotional dysregulation. Left out an S there, but GG, get wrecked, noobs. Emotional dysregulation, identity issues, and relationship issues. And we'll get to relationships in a bit. So what we kind of see is that like BPD has these two, but BPD doesn't have these. So BPD, so now like this is really important to understand. C-PTSD is this plus this. BPD is just this without this and then maybe some additional stuff. Does that make sense? So we know that trauma can cause this if it's one time. If it's chronic, causes this. And if it's chronic, causes this. But depending on the nature of the trauma and the frequency and your genetics and stuff like that, like it kind of changes the manifestation. So the reason I think this lecture is super important is because I am seeing this as its own independent set of the cluster of symptoms grow in the population. More and more people are having problems with this without necessarily this or this. Okay? So what happens in C-PTSD is we have a disordered sense of identity. Which then results in all kinds of problems. Okay? So the first thing is in BPD, the way that people feel about me determines the way that I feel about myself. So there's no persistent sense of self to fight against other people's opinions. Right? If I'm confident in here, people can bully me and I can fight back. But in BPD, they can't do that. And in the C-PTSD, they can't do that. Because this is not well formed. The reason it's not well formed is because we're so emotionally dysregulated that we do not lay down a foundation of who we are. This also creates all kinds of other problems. So in C-PTSD and in BPD, we see that there's a lot of impulsivity. So why is there impulsivity? So on the one hand, there's paralysis of initiation. So people have difficulty getting things started. That's the video that we're going to watch at the end of the deep dive today, by the way. Okay, so we're going to teach all this because this is like half of our community struggles with this. I have trouble getting started. And it's so cool that the research on trauma helps us understand why your brain has difficulty getting started. So we have difficulty getting started, and then we also have impulsivity, very common in complex PTSD. And the question is why? So impulsivity is the desire to do something for a little while. Right? So it's like, I'm impulsive. So impulsive is not inaction, it is temporary action. It is sudden action. And so what we see a lot is people have difficulty with follow through. Right? I can't stay consistent. Why? So if you look at where consistency comes from two places, the environment outside you. If you have an environment that is structured, then you will be consistent. Right? So like, let's say you're in prison. And like, I used to have patients who would tell me, oh yeah, I had such big problems with insomnia. And I was like, what worked for you? And he's like, going to prison. I don't have insomnia anymore. And I was like, why not? And he's like, well, I have no choice. I have no cell phone. I have to go to sleep at the same time. I've been here for 3 years. For 365 days, for 3 years in a row, I've gone to sleep at the same time and I wake up at the same time. Like, I have no choice. But if we do not have a horribly structured life, then our consistency comes from our sense of identity. right? Why do you go to the gym every day? Because I want to be in shape. I want to be healthy. I enjoy it. Why do you play games every day? I enjoy them. Why do you play games every day? I don't know. I hate them. So your sense of self is what gives you a drive in a direction over time. So I've worked with a couple, but I'm thinking about one Olympic athlete many years ago. And so, like, when I talked to this person, you know, like, how did you, I was so curious. I was like, this is the first person I worked with who was an Olympic athlete. I was like, how did you become an Olympic athlete? Like, tell me about that. Like, what's that like? And it's like a very strong sense of self that drives you forward so that when there are setbacks, when RNG happens, that strong sense of self keeps you focused on the task at hand. So what is impulsivity? So impulsivity is a combination of emotional dysregulation and a lack of sense of self. So when my emotions arise over here and I don't have a grounding from in here, I'll jump over there. And as the emotion disappears, I stop doing it because I have no driving force from in here. So another very common feature of C-PTSD is impulsivity and paradoxically paralysis of initiation. So how can those two things go together? Well, like, because remember, it's not, the problem with paralysis of initiation is that you want to start something, but you can't bring yourself to start it. So if you're someone who really struggles to get things started, what you will find is that there's a correlation between getting things started and being impulsive. Because in both cases, you're not in control. In both cases, in one case, you can't drive over your emotions. And in the other case, your emotions are taking advantage of you and they're making you impulsive. And now you do this and now you do that. So these are common features in C-PTSD, and they have to do with a combination of lack of identity and emotional dysregulation. Now we get to the third thing, which is relationships. So people who have C-PTSD have difficulty in their relationships. Now, this is where we get to some really cool neuroscience. So, I think it's here. Okay, let's actually take a look at some science to kind of support these points, okay? So, what we find in people who have C-PTSD is that they have poor emotional awareness. So they're not aware when they're feeling emotions, right? This is a result of like this dissociative pathway or hemispheric lateralization. So, and as emotional awareness enables increased self-reflection and regulation of affective states, it is often considered a cornerstone of emotion regulation. So let's understand this for a moment. So you can't regulate an emotion unless you're aware of an emotion. And as we dissociate and we numb ourselves to our emotions, then we can't regulate them. Now, this is very important to understand. When you numb yourself to an emotion, it doesn't mean that the emotion is inactive. It just means that you're not aware of its activity. So what happens when someone dissociates is that they don't feel any emotion, but that part of their brain doesn't completely shut off. It is still active. We're just not aware of it. So people who struggle with C-PTSD will be less emotionally aware at some times and also paradoxically hyper emotionally aware at other times. Okay? So we're not going to go into the neurobiology of emotional self-awareness. I think that's a bit too detailed. But let's talk about this. Okay? The neurocircuitry underlying emotional numbing in PTSD. So increased emotional numbing symptoms predicted decreased brain activation within the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex during imagery of both positive and negative social scripts, consistent with the role of dorsomedial prefrontal cortex in higher order reflective and metacognitive aspects of emotional functioning. So we'll explain what that means in a second. I just want to read this too. So the development of neural circuitry facilitating blah, 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 may therefore be disturbed in PTSD, leading to the difficulties these individuals often have in reflecting on, interpreting, and acting in accordance with emotion. A patient suffering from PTSD related to prolonged childhood abuse summarized feelings of emotional numbing in the following statement. It's like a blank. I think about my kids and I feel nothing for them. I'll be sitting there feeling confused and numb, and I wonder what I'm supposed to be feeling. It's like dead space. And when that happens, I have trouble using words, finding my words, and I can't talk. So let's understand how you can have numbness and feel emotionally dysregulated. This is what we mean by dysregulated. Dysregulation doesn't just mean hyperactivity. It also means low levels of activity and high levels of activity at the same time. And this is where the neuroscience becomes important. So as we look at the neuroscience of C-PTSD versus PTSD, we find that there's actually different places that emotions come from in the brain. And it turns out that the C-PTSD affects different regions. Okay, so now we're going to get into the neuroscience. So we have our amygdala, and then we have this dorsomedial prefrontal cortex. Now remember, as we looked at this paper, we saw that decreased activation within the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, okay? So this is like a different region. So most of the time when we talk about emotions, what most people, especially pop neuroscientists like myself, will talk about is the amygdala. This is the fear center, the survival center, the anxiety center of the brain. Fear, anxiety, survival. And what we find in people with PTSD is that this is hyperactive. So like, think about how fucked this is. Okay? I want you to think about this. This is so fucked. Pardon my language. So here we have presumably a man or woman, I'm not sure, who is emotionally dysregulated, so has like panic attacks and stuff like that, has hyperarousal, and then when they look at their kids, they feel confused and numb. So this is not fair. So we feel confused and numb to our positive emotions, but we have a hyperactivity of our negative emotions. Like, how is that fair? Panic and anxiety and fear we can feel normally or even at hyperactive levels, because remember, in PTSD we're aroused. But love and things like that I can't feel. So this is something very important to understand. The amygdala is where we feel fear and anxiety and survival stuff. But a lot of our positive emotions, a lot of our other emotions come from other parts of the brain, like the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex. And so what we see in complex PTSD is specifically a deactivation of those parts of the brain. We see a deactivation of the positive emotional circuits of the brain, which is actually the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex. While we see a hyperactivation of the amygdala, which is our fear center. Now, the reason I think this is important is I see this in a lot of people who do not have CPTSD. I see a hyperactivation of our fear for the future. The world is going to hell. I'm screwed. I'm going to be alone. Today is Friday, so we have a bunch of posts on our subreddit about how everyone is hopeless. And yet they have a hyperactivation of their negative emotions, but a hypoactivation of their positive emotions. How is this fair? It's not. Now we understand the neuroscientific mechanism, right? It's because not all emotions come from the same place. And what we see in CPTSD is hypoactivation of the dorsomedial part of the brain. So this is where, look, positive emotion, dorsomedial prefrontal cortex. Negative emotion is also kind of in the same place. Anyway, it's kind of weird. The amygdala, I think, is usually over here. But, yeah, it's also weird because this person's backwards. Anyway, so we may experience some negative emotion there. It's complicated. So now what we're going to do is talk a little bit. Okay, so that's emotional dysregulation. Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about self-awareness and identity, okay? So specifically during traumatic memory recall, increasing severity of trait alexithymia, we talk a lot about alexithymia, which is emotional color blindness, was associated with reduced activity within the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and anterior insula. Okay, we talked about kindling. So I think we already covered this. Okay, now let's talk about identity, right? So remember we said that this disturbs our sense of identity. Individuals with PTSD often exhibit disturbances in self-referential processing. Johnson et al. Proposed that the ability to reflect upon oneself requires a robust sense of self, which has been described as a collection of schemata regarding one's abilities, traits, and attitudes that guides our behaviors, choices, and social interactions. So we kind of already explained this, but does this make sense? Like the sense of self is a collection of ideas, they use schemata because it's not quite an idea, about your abilities, your traits, and your attitudes. I like tacos. I don't like hot dogs. I'm good at this game. I'm bad at studying. I'm a dog person. I'm a cat person. I'm a night owl. I'm a morning lark. Like we have like this kind of stuff. And then also when we have these kinds of beliefs about ourselves, they affect our behaviors, choices, and social interactions. Right? So if I am a gamer, if I identify as a gamer, I'm more likely to play more video games. So now let's understand the mechanism through which people with C-PTSD have difficulty doing this. Neuroimaging studies suggest that self-referential processing is partly mediated via cortical midline structures. We're going to focus on the anterior cingulate, okay? And the temporal pulse, temporoparietal junction and temporal pulse. Let's see if that, no. Okay. All right. So this is where basically what happens is the parts of our brain that give us our sense of self, which is the anterior cingulate, the default mode network, and our temporoparietal regions of the brain. These parts are impaired in CPTSD. So our sense of self does not function quite the same way. Now, if you all remember at the very beginning, I said, if you electrically stimulate the temporoparietal junction, this is not the junction, but those regions of the brain are impaired in CPTSD. If I electrically stimulate the temporoparietal junction, I will trigger an out-of-body experience. So what is an out-of-body experience? An out-of-body experience is an experience of my consciousness existing outside of my body, right? So this is the part of the brain that governs like my experience of self. And if it is impaired in some way, my sense of identity will not form well. If my sense of identity does not form well, that'll result in problems in terms of behaviors, the choices that I make, etc. The last dimension that we're going to talk about is relationships. So in order to have a relationship, we must have a sense of identity, because a relationship is something between me and you. There's a chunk of you in there, and there's a chunk of me in there. But if my sense of identity is disturbed, my capacity to have a relationship with another human being is impaired. Practically what this looks like is something very similar to BPD, where when you have CPTSD and you try to have a relationship with someone else, like, you don't add a whole lot to the equation. I'm not saying that you don't factually add value to the relationship. What I'm saying is that your personality does not enter and shape the relationship in the same way that someone who has a well-formed sense of identity does. You know, sometimes what this means is that you become a doormat, you become a people pleaser, you don't really have a whole lot of strong opinions, you become a chameleon. These are all three different variants of how CPTSD shapes our relationships. In BPD, like sometimes, like, so I've worked with some women who have BPD, and the people that they date feel like they found the perfect partner for the first couple of weeks, because whatever their partner is into, they're into. And like, I've had friends, male friends, who've probably dated women with BPD, and I've heard the way that they describe them. They'll say like, "Oh my God, this person is amazing. She's into like anime, and she's into this, and she hates wine, and she loves beer. She loves matcha, but she hates coffee. She's like perfect. She's like a female version of me, and she's hot." And so they'll say things like this, and the gender roles can be reversed too. Absolutely. But what happens is when we don't have a sense of self, it becomes hard to have a relationship because we absorb the other person's things. So in BPD, it's more about absorption of the other person. In CPTSD, it doesn't have to be that way. We can see doormat, we can see people pleaser, because I don't have a sense of identity. And once we have these doormat and people pleaser tendencies, we also open ourselves up for more toxicity in relationships, because I don't advocate for myself. Right? Because you're better than I am. I don't have a sense when you treat me like crap. I do not have something in here that instinctively rebels. So if you have a well-formed sense of identity and someone treats you like crap, you recognize that you deserve better. And that idea that you deserve better, where does that idea comes from? It comes from a sense of self. Just think about the mechanics of this, okay? Think about the language that I'm using. When I say I deserve better, there is a stable conception of what this quantity of I deserves. I don't deserve $10 million. I don't deserve $0. I deserve $100. That is based on your identity. Now, in the case of narcissism, that identity is too high. So what that means is if anyone, remember this root of narcissism is actually insecurity. So if anyone gives you even 1% less than you deserve, you become prickly like a porcupine. And you're like, I deserve better. And it's like, bro, like you got what you deserve. This is crazy. Like I did everything that I could for you. And the opposite is also true, where when you don't deserve any, like when you don't have a sense of self, then how can you deserve if you have no no stable sense of self and what you deserve? So this creates all kinds of problems in relationships. And we see that in CPTSD, right? So the disturbances of self-organization result in emotional dysregulation, hyperactivity using something like a kindling mechanism, especially in the negative emotional regions of the brain, where you have this sub-threshold electrical activity that then activates. It's like you're just going about your day, and then suddenly you feel intensely sad, and you're like, what the fuck, right? You don't actually think that way because it's normal for you, but people outside of you look at you, and they're like, I don't understand why this person just gets so upset so randomly. And they do what they can to help. And if you know people in your life who do this, right, they just go into funks for like very intensely for a day, and you're like, what's wrong? And they're like, I don't know, or nothing. And then if you're like a normal person, right? And I don't mean that in a judgmental way. I mean that if you have a brain that is not developed like this, you look at this and you say, tell me what's wrong. And they say nothing's wrong, and they're fucking crying their eyes out. And you're like, what the fuck? Because and the thing is, in their case, they're right. Nothing is wrong. This is what's wild about trauma. See, when you look at someone like that and you think there must be something wrong. Why? Because in order for you to cry that hard, you need something that is so powerful that it overcomes your sense of self and makes you cry really hard. In their case, they have a fucking seizure-like activity in their amygdala that just dysregulates their emotion, and they're crying for no reason. It's not no reason. It's all kinds of weird emotions that have been stored up. They're not relevant to the circumstances at play. Does that make sense? So it's like the brain is different. And this is what's so sad when I work with these people is like they don't understand this. They're like, what the fuck is wrong with me? And this is a crazy thing. There is something wrong with you. That's not a bad thing. It's not fundamental. I mean, it's sort of fundamental, but the brain is activating in a different way. The rules that the brain is playing by are different. That's what's wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with your personhood. The way that your neurons are activating are closer to a seizure, which is why you have this disrupted emotional regulation. And you just feel things so intensely, and it comes out of nowhere, and it's so confusing, and it's so debilitating. Okay? And then there's also dorsomedial numbness, which results in like not being able to like do things like feel spontaneous love for your kids and all that kind of stuff. It's all super sad and super debilitating. CPTSD is a really bad diagnosis. Good news is that it can get you can get way better, right? So this is not, it's not your destiny. So the cool thing, and I guess we'll get into this now, is that we actually know we have a sequence of things that you can do that will sustainably get you better. Now, there are a couple of good things about treatment. The first thing to understand is that trauma is an adaptation, which means that you weren't born this way. This is your brain adapting to circumstances, which means that if your brain adapted once, it can adapt again, right? This is very different from something like having a genetic, two recessive alleles that result in a genetic deficiency. In the blueprint of what your body is capable of making, there is a problem. So until we get to gene replacement therapy, like there's nothing that can be done about that, right? Like the fundamental machinery, like there's no, it's like we're building a computer, but there's like no place for the CPU, right? And then like there's no way to get that computer to work. The good news about trauma is even though it is so debilitating, even though it feels like it screws over every dimension of your life, the majority of it can get better because these are all adaptations. They're not the core thing. They're the stuff that you've layered on top. So you can systematically go about changing that. Okay? So how do we change this? The first thing that we have to do is rewire our physiology. Okay? So we go through this in a more step-by-step process in the guide. So a lot of people with trauma, and Van der Kolk is a big advocate of this. So he runs this place called the Center of Trauma, and they do a lot of yoga. So what we tend to find is there are a couple of key principles. The first is you have to be comfortable in your own body. And mind-body practices are very good at doing this. So what we specifically want to do to be comfortable within our own body, our body has this sense of, we actually have 6 senses, okay? The 6th sense. The 6th sense is not being able to see dead people. The 6th sense is something called proprioception. So proprioception is our sense of our body in space. So if I like close my eyes and I lift my arm, I can tell where my arm is. That's technically not the same as touching something, right? This is like a sense of where my body is. And proprioception seems to be really good at helping us rewire our physiology. So a lot of studies show that things like yoga and Tai Chi are very effective for conditions that have hyperactivity of the central nervous system. Or sorry, not central, autonomic nervous system. Panic attacks, high blood pressure, anxiety disorders, postural orthostatic tachycardic syndrome. Mind-body practices are really good at this. We know that mind-body practices recruit things like the vagus nerve, which is our primary parasympathetic nerve in the body. So when we meditate, our vagus nerve turns on. It slows down our heart rate. It decreases our blood pressure. It activates our GI system. It does all kinds of good stuff. So practically what I describe is what we really want to do is something called autonomic stretch. So the best way to, so this is important to understand. So remember that our nervous system, our autonomic nervous system has sympathetic and parasympathetic, okay? Let me actually go back to this. Does this work? Okay, great. So I'm going to show you all this, okay? So let's take a look. Okay. So our nervous system, our autonomic nervous system has sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system, okay? So normally what happens is this one is active about 50% of the time, and this one is active about 50% of the time, and anywhere between 45 minutes and 2 hours is the oscillation between the two. So the problem with stress is not the stress, it's that it's chronic. So when we have chronic stress, we have 90% activation over here, and we have 10% activation over here. So it becomes difficult. Then what happens is our body gets stuck in this mode. So anytime the body gets stuck, it loses flexibility. I know it's kind of like a silly statement, but so in physical medicine, right? So physical medicine and rehab, sometimes we'll have something called a muscle contracture. So muscle contracture is when you hold your body in a certain way, okay? And when you, wow, that vein looks fucking huge. Sorry, I was distracted by fucking, it's a real pity I don't shoot heroin because that's one hell of a vein. Okay, so This is why I love streaming. Like, you know, when I'm like teaching at like medical schools, like you can't do that. All right, this is why I love teaching here. All right. So if I hold my body in a particular posture, I will develop something called a contracture. So a muscle can get locked into tightness. Okay. So if I'm like sitting at my computer all day, the trapezius will get very tight. Your scalene muscles will get very tight. Your anterior scalenes will get super tight. If you want to feel how tight your anterior scalenes are, by the way, this is a super cool exercise you can do. What I want you all to do is tuck your chin back and turn. And what you'll feel if you just tuck your chin back and then turn, you'll feel like this super tight muscle over here. So when our muscles are in a sustained contraction, they lose flexibility. So this happens in our nervous system as well. They get locked into a hyperactivation of the sympathetic nervous system. So what we want to do is increase our autonomic stretch. And the beautiful thing about this is that when you look at stress, okay, this is fascinating. You can meditate to decrease stress, or you can exercise to decrease stress. That's weird, because when you exercise, you're not relaxing. You're actually doing the opposite. You are activating the sympathetic nervous system. So the cool thing about autonomic stretch is anytime we hyperactivate the sympathetic nervous system, we automatically send a signal to our body that we are going to rest when we are done. So if I'm at a chronic state of stress, okay, so let's say that this is the midpoint. And let's say this is sympathetic nervous system. This is parasympathetic nervous system. So most of us live over here. But if you are in a chronic stress state, you live over here. So how do we get things back over here? One thing we can do is meditate. Meditate brings us here. And then after we're done meditating, maybe we'll go to there. The other thing that we can actually do is exercise. So exercising will actually bring us up here. But when we get up here, right? So when you exercise a lot, what do you feel like doing? You feel like resting. So if I run really, really hard and my CO2 level spikes and my O2 level starts to drop as I'm increasing muscular respiration, my body is like, oh crap, we've run out of oxygen. Now sit the fuck down and rest. So we feel exhausted after exercise. We don't feel energetic, which means that once we hit this point, this triggers a signal in our body to go back down here. And then when we end up, we'll end up here. Now, the cool thing is when you do both exercise and meditate, you will get here faster. And if you do this kind of thing, it will actually improve your autonomic arousal. So it'll help with things like trauma. It'll help with things like generalized anxiety disorder. It'll help with things like panic attacks. You can do both. The key thing is actually oscillating. See, if I want to stretch a muscle, stretching a muscle isn't just doing this. Stretching a muscle is doing this and then doing this and then doing this and then doing this. This is what really increases flexibility. Okay? It's not just going like this and keeping it there. This in turn will lock the muscle into this configuration. So we want to alternate between the two. So as we rewire that physiology, our hyperarousal will come down. Second thing we need to do is reconnect with our emotions. Now, this is where the cool thing is that we actually don't have to reconnect with our emotions to reconnect with our emotions. Okay? Give me a second. Let me see if I can find this. Let's see if I can find, I think it's over here. Hold on, you guys can look with me. Ah, shit. There we go. Okay. Thank God I remember the word that they used. Okay. Okay, so conceptual emotional awareness refers to the ability to reflect on, interpret, and make a decision about an embodied sensation or emotion. Okay? So there are a couple of different things that we can do to increase our self-awareness. Where is this? Yeah. Okay. During this phase of treatment, patients have to develop an awareness and language that helps them identify bodily sensations and how different bodily sensations relate to different emotional experiences. For example, for one person, tension in the jaw in combination with a feeling of tightness in the throat may correlate with sadness, while in another individual, sadness may correlate with tightness in the stomach and a feeling of heaviness in the chest. By developing emotional awareness, patients can learn to identify precursors, blah, 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 blah. Okay? So there's basically 2 or 3 things that we're going to do to reconnect with our emotions. The first is just be aware of your bodily sensations. So remember, and this is what's cool about the neuroscience. Okay? I'm going to try to explain this because this is huge, but I don't know if I can explain it. So if we look at this paper, okay? What this paper tells us, where's table 1, is that different parts of our brain are messed up by PTSD. Come on, table 1. Where are you, table 1? There we go. Okay. So we look at table 1. Here are all the things that are affected. So medial prefrontal cortex, self-referential, let's look at the anterior cingulate, integrates cognitive and emotional aspects of experience, right? We have all these different parts of the brain. Now, the thing is, these parts of the brain have these broad functions, right? So the thing to understand about the brain is we used to think that like a particular part of the brain does a particular thing. But what I want y'all to understand is that regions of the brain are like letters of the alphabet. The way that they connect and combine with each other is actually what creates a particular phenomenon in our life. So curiosity or love, there isn't a love center to the brain. A love center, the way we experience love in the brain, I can just hypothesize based on this, is some medial prefrontal cortex, some anterior cingulate cortex, some amygdala, and some insula. See, when we combine self-referential, this is me, I am in love, and there's an emotional aspect, there's emotional salience. What that means is feeling this means this thing. What is the significance of the emotion? I have a sense of me, I have this emotion, I attach a significance to the emotion, and then I also have some degree of fear. Because what if this person doesn't love me back? And then I also have bodily self-awareness, because when they're around, I start to feel changes in my body. My body changes. I ache for you. I need your body. That's what love is. So there isn't a love part of the brain. It is a concert of different parts of the brain interacting with each other. Okay? Literally. So if you guys have been in love, you know what I mean. Like your body aches for someone else. Like think about that from a neuroscientific perspective. You can't ache for someone else unless the part of your body that senses your sensations is aware of what you feel and hear is active in some way. Okay? So now we have a problem, which is that these parts of the brain are shut off in trauma. Simplification. So the cool thing is that in order to reverse this process, we do not have to fix it. We just have to awaken the part of the brain. See, if we increase the activity of the brain, if we reawaken our dorsomedial cortex, prefrontal cortex, right? This is where positive emotions come from. All we have to do is activate that in some way, and once it's on, it will start to feel other things. We see this in clinical trials, and I see it in my clinical practice. I'm somewhat extrapolating here. So in clinical trials on yoga for trauma, just think about this for a second. What the fuck is the mechanism? It's not just autonomic nervous system. What's happening is we are activating this part of the brain through this yogic practice. I can't find the sentence in this paper, but even the paper sort of talks about all we have to do is just activate the part of the brain. Even just increasing your awareness of emotions and even awareness of your body. You don't have to increase awareness of emotions. You can just increase awareness of the body and you will have an increased awareness of emotion. Why? Because some part of an emotion is physical. Butterflies in the stomach, tightness in the throat. So you can kind of back end emotional awareness through bodily awareness. Then what you can do is, by the way, I don't know if y'all noticed this, but we've been teaching all this crap for years. And that wasn't because I read this paper. It's because I sort of found this in my clinical experience, that especially for men, accessing their emotions through their body is very good. Okay, so increased autonomic flexibility, number one. Increased awareness of the body, number two. Third thing is articulate your emotions physically if you don't have awareness of them. Fourth thing we want to do. What's the fourth thing? Oh yeah, articulate our emotions. Actually attach language to them. This we go into in a lot more detail. We can't go into everything in all detail in the guide. But the cool thing is, remember, we have this problem of hemispheric lateralization, which means negative emotions are over here, or emotions are over here, and language is over here. When we have decreased awareness, decreased communication through decreased activity across the corpus callosum, right and left hemispheres aren't talking. What do you feel? I don't know. Frustrated, stressed. Those aren't emotion. Frustration is an emotion. There's no emotional nuance. So in order to literally articulate your emotion, you have to increase the connectivity. So as I ask you, what do you feel? What do you feel? What do you feel? As you struggle to answer, what's going on is your neurons from this side are reaching over and connecting with your neurons over here. What do I feel? It's like hard. It's like you're reaching, trying to grab it. And even if you fail to say the right thing, even if you don't know what you experience, you don't know what you feel, those neurons are reaching. That's where the money is. So I've seen this a lot where people feel like the therapy isn't working because they don't see progress in 3 weeks. And if you're looking for the ability to articulate in 3 weeks, it's not going to happen, but the therapy is working because your neurons are reaching across the corpus callosum, bridging that chasm, and eventually they'll figure it out. And if they figure it out, then once they figure it out, it's figured out. You will level up your EQ. You will level up your emotional awareness, and that will be a neuronal connection that is formed. This is why I have hope for people with trauma. See, everyone thinks it's all about these temporary states, like I'm emotional. No, what we're doing is we're laying neuronal highways. And when the highway is 90% built, there's no traffic. But the moment it gets built, you can get a ton of traffic across. So what I tend to see when I work with people is that their progress is nothing, 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 boom. Nothing, 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 boom. Nothing, 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 nothing. So this is what we want to do. We want to utilize language. So as we discover our emotions, then that allows us to do a couple of different things. Okay, so we're going to go back to this person who's numb. Oh, God. Where's that quote? Looking for the one. Oh, yeah. Okay, here it is. So, remember this, where we say, it's a blank. I think about my kids and I feel nothing for them. I'll be sitting there feeling confused and numb, and I wonder what's supposed to, it's like a dead space, right? So this is dorsomedial prefrontal cortex is not active. Now, when this person lives this life, and they go to their child's birthday party and they feel nothing, there's nothing, they don't have a sense, like their identity is lost. Does this make sense? Because like, if you think about what does it mean to be a parent? Like, I went to this birthday party for my kid. I planned it. I saw the joy on their face. I saw all their friends be super, super happy. They've been struggling to make friends at school, but everyone had such a good time that now their social like status amongst their friends is now improved. So that makes me happy. Now I feel like a good parent. But I can't feel like a good parent unless I can connect with the joy in my child. So not only does this person feel emotionally numb, their sense of identity is going to be compromised. So that's where once we start feeling things, we're going to do two things to rebuild our sense of identity. The first is there's a lot of dormant negative emotion, which our mind has dissociated from, which still lingers there. And the reason we dissociate from it is because it's overwhelming. If we let it overwhelm us, our sense of identity will get swept away. So as we start connecting the two parts of our brain and articulating stuff, all of that emotional energy starts getting vented, and essentially the negative emotions that we store start leaving. If you do this process in psychotherapy, even better, because it'll go faster. As these things start to leave, then your negative sense of identity will disappear with it. The second thing that'll happen is you will start to be able to engage in positive experiences, which will then recreate your identity. So now when you climb to the top of the mountain, you'll feel something. And then you'll be like, I did it. Right? So in both cases, you did it. But in one case, you don't feel that you did it. And in the other case, you feel that you did it. You need that dorsomedial prefrontal activation to feel like you did it. Okay? Then what happens is once we awaken different parts of the brain, where's scan? I'm going to show you all a different paper. Hold on. I can't find it. What the fuck? Okay, I'll just explain it to y'all without showing y'all the paper, okay? I'll try to find it later. Oh. Okay. So, next thing is what did I want to say? So the next thing is that if we look at the neuroscience of emotions, what we now know is that not all emotions are like the same neuroscience. So we have something called affective neuroscience, which is the emotions that relate to like the way that we feel about the way that we feel about ourselves, not about ourselves, the way that we feel. Let me start over. So we now know that emotions can be divided into two camps. Affective neuroscience are the emotions that are independent of society. So, for example, if I'm hiking down a mountain and a bear shows up, like I can feel fear or joy or whatever, right? Like I can feel that. Like I don't need a human being. But if we look at human emotions, there's a pile of human emotions that require a social connection. Shame, guilt, pride. You cannot be proud without someone observing your pride. You cannot be shamed without being observed. You can't feel guilty without doing something bad for someone else. So what we've actually discovered is that there are a couple of different emotional centers in the brain. And these primitive emotions that reptiles can feel fear, they can feel anger, right? But I don't know that reptiles can feel proud. Like, I don't know if like a crocodile like has the social connection with other crocodiles to feel pride. When we get to primates and stuff, they absolutely can. So there is a social connection pile of emotions. Those emotions exist in a different part of the brain. They get activated under different circumstances. So once we start developing our identity, these emotions will arise as well. They will start getting fixed. Once these emotions get fixed, so it's not just the sense of identity. So now I built a sense of identity and my social cognitive emotions have become active. So once these two things get fixed, now I can fix relationships. Because when the shame within me is haywire and not functioning correctly, it becomes very hard to engage in a relationship. My partner tells me, I love you, I think you're beautiful. And I feel ashamed of myself, so I say, no, I'm not. So that becomes hard until that part of my brain gets kind of cleaned out and normalized. Then I can do things like accept compliments. Okay? So then the last thing to get fixed is relationships. Now, in our community, why is this important? See, in our community, there's a lot of people, especially because today's a Friday and Friday is Relationships Day, who are saying, I'm struggling to get into a relationship. And outside of our community, it's not just our community, everyone's struggling to get into a relationship, right? Some people are, having sex and stuff. Some people are friends with benefits. Very few people are happy with their relationships. And people say, how do I fix my relationship? How do I fix my relationship? And what everyone says is work on yourself first. And then people get frustrated by this answer. Now I hope y'all understand the mechanism. See, this is where, when I see people tweeting stuff, I can't say all of this. But if you want to understand how to fix your relationship, or if anyone you know wants to understand how to fix their relationship, they need to watch this video. Because we have to understand that the relationship is at the height of what a human being can fix. It is at the top of the pyramid. You can't fix a relationship if you don't feel emotions. You can't fix a relationship if your emotions are dysregulated. You can't fix a relationship if your dorsomedial prefrontal cortex cannot feel joy and accomplishment. You can't fix a relationship if your sense of identity turns you into either a chameleon or a doormat. The best way to make a healthy relationship is to be a healthy human being. Now, this gets even further complicated because part of being a healthy human being can come through relationships, absolutely. But this is what we're talking about, right? So this is where people say, how do I get this person to do this, get this person to do this, get this person to do this? And here I am, I'm talking about how to fix your relationships, and I've not given you one iota of advice about what to do if someone doesn't text you back. And I don't need to, and you don't need it. If the brain that has evolved for millions of years to allow you to engage in relationships, I hate to break it to y'all, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, there weren't all these guides from Dr. K about how to get laid or how to go on a date or how to set boundaries. None of that crap existed, and people got along. What has changed? This has changed. The activity of this, the function of this. So if you fix this, if you fix your sense of identity, fix your emotional awareness, because why do we end up in bad relationships? Because we're not aware of our emotions. When someone doesn't text me back in 5 minutes, I get angry. I can't regulate that anger. There's emotional dysregulation. There are perception problems. We haven't touched on perception yet, but we talk about it in the guide. There's all kinds of problems. And then we'll have a whole video on sex and sex and trauma, too, because that's really important. Okay? So, complex PTSD. Oh, let me show y'all one last thing. I lost it, chat. Oh boy. Hold on. There's something I got to show y'all, okay? This is very important. Okay, I can, okay, here it is. So let's talk about treatment, okay? So we talked a little bit, teaching PTSD patients with impairments in emotional awareness to identify their affective feelings early on in treatment and make exposure-based treatments more effective. So we need to understand our emotions. Yoga has also been suggested to be effective in treating PTSD, partially by increasing one's interoceptive ability. Here's what I want to show y'all. Okay. Further evidence for the latter stems from investigation by Hagenars, who reported a differential outcome for PTSD patients with high versus low dissociative symptomatology. Okay? So remember, dissociation is hemispheric lateralization. And remember that exposure therapy is oftentimes what we do. So let's take a step back, and I got to explain this. I realized I didn't talk about this. So one of the treatments for PTSD is exposure therapy. So the reason that we do exposure therapy is if, let's say that I'm a war veteran, and when I hear a door slam, my brain, because I'm hyper aroused, triggers like we're getting bombed.exe. That's the basic problem in PTSD, is that we go to war and we hear a loud bang, and then our brain is like, I'm going to code we're getting bombed.exe. Anytime you hear a loud noise, fucking dive under the table. So now as I return back to life, I will hear loud noises all the time. Car mufflers going off, doors slamming, and then now I'm triggering we're getting bombed.exe. So we get this hyper arousal. So one of the ways to fix that is to expose people to things that induce their traumatic hyperarousal response until they acclimatize to it. So as I slam doors over and over and over again, eventually, like, my brain will realize, oh, like, we're getting bomb.exe is not appropriate here. We don't need to pull this up. And so exposure therapy is effective, okay? But this is what's cool. So whereas only 10% of PTSD patients with low dissociative criteria symptoms still met PTSD criteria after a trial of exposure therapy, 69% of PTSD patients with high levels of dissociation continued to meet PTSD criteria at follow-up. So I'll translate that for y'all if y'all didn't catch that. If I take someone with PTSD who does not dissociate and I give them exposure therapy, only 10% of them still have PTSD. So let's presume that 90% of them get better. If I take someone with a high amount of dissociation and a diagnosis of PTSD, and I just give them exposure therapy, 69% of them will still have PTSD. So we can conclude, not entirely fair, right? Because this is science and you can't make conclusions like that, that simple exposure therapy doesn't work for people who have high dissociative symptoms. If you have complex PTSD, you're going to be further in that direction. So let's see what they discovered. Therefore, it is crucial before commencing exposure-based treatments to assess the level of emotional overmodulation and provide interventions to reduce such symptomatic responses in trauma-related stimuli. Okay? So basically what this talks about STARE, which is a trauma treatment program. But basically what I'm trying to tell y'all is that, see, in Western medicine, we think that there is a diagnosis and diagnosis has treatment. If you've got bipolar disorder, take this medication. If you've got ADHD, take this medication, it'll fix it. If you've got PTSD, do exposure therapy, it'll fix it. And we're not wrong to think that. Because we do trials, right? And like only 10% of people who had PTSD still have symptoms of it after exposure therapy if they're low on dissociation. But what I found with complex PTSD especially is that the more complex your presentation of difficulty is, we can call it a diagnosis or we can call it an illness, the more that we have all of these building blocks. And the key thing is to build one block on top of the other, and then you can get back to 100%. Most of y'all. I've seen it time and time and time again. And the reason that treatments don't work is because we're not comprehensive enough. Real trauma treatment, see, trauma doesn't just affect, there's not one part of the brain that's misactive. Your autonomic nervous system, your brain, different parts of your brain. Some parts are hyperactive, some parts are hypoactive. Your sense of self, your relationships, your motivation, your impulsivity, your ability to control your impulses, everything is affected by trauma. This is why trauma is the great chameleon. So many people I've worked with have a diagnosis of ADHD, but they really have trauma. So many people I work with have a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, but they have trauma. So trauma can look like just about anything. Okay? All right, so what we're going to do now, so don't give up, first of all. Like, things can get better. And the only reason that we don't think they can get better, so put yourself in the shoes of someone who did exposure therapy. They go to a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist is very well trained and very intelligent. Says, oh, you have a diagnosis of PTSD, go to exposure therapy. At the end of exposure therapy, they still have PTSD. 69%. Because this one-dimensional treatment is not effective. In a certain class of people, it's very effective. And this is the way that y'all need to approach trauma if you're struggling with it. It's not just one thing. It is not fixing a problem. It is rebuilding yourself from the ground up. And you say, Dr. K, that sounds like too much work. It's not. See, the only reason it feels like too much work is if you've done a lot of work and it has yielded no results. Then it feels like effort is useless. Anything feels like too much work if you're doing it wrong. Is it a lot of work? Absolutely. Is it hard to do? Absolutely. But my overwhelming experience as a clinician is that people are into it. Once you start making progress, once you're able to go to your child's birthday party and be like, wow, I'm so glad they had such a good time and I feel like a good parent. It's like, you guys want that fucking vein? Like, that's like heroin in your veins right there. You begin to live the life the way that your evolution has designed you for. This is the way we are supposed to live. And it's like drinking water after running 5 miles. It just feels so good. It's just water. People say, oh my God, I don't like the taste of water. Or they drink soda all day. And then but this is the key thing to understand. Whether water tastes good to you or not depends on what your body is doing. Whether treatment is hard or easy depends on what you're doing, what you're getting out of it. This is the biggest mistake that we make. So don't give up hope. Absolutely go see someone if this stuff resonates with you. If you guys want to better understand these principles, check out the guide. We're going to watch a video in a second. Right, this is not a place where I would recommend coaching. This is not where coaching is that helpful. I mean, it can be for some of these things like paralysis of initiation and motivation and stuff like that. But like, this is where y'all should see a therapist, right? A trauma-informed specialist is ideal because they will understand more of these principles. Okay? Now, let's see. Okay, so we're going to get to questions in a second. I love Leaf Blower Friday. So do I. Fucking A, so do I. All right? So, like, y'all, don't give up hope. Like, it is crazy how much we know about trauma. We've gotten so much better at this. The last thing that I want to say is this disturbed sense of self-organization outside of trauma. See, if you have DSO without the symptoms of PTSD, you can't get a diagnosis of C-PTSD. C-PTSD is hyperarousal, hypervigilance, all the regular trauma stuff, plus the disturbed sense of self-organization, disturbance of self-organization. So what I'm noticing in the world today is that this disturbed self-organization appears to be independent of traumatic events. I'm seeing a society that is increasingly emotionally dysregulated, increasingly unable to tap into joy, increasingly easy to trigger a seizure of negative emotion, increasingly confused about their identity in life, and increased difficulty in relationships. So now the question that I've really wondered is that if you see this DSO picture, can you do these trauma-based interventions? You don't need exposure therapy, but can we do all of this other stuff? Calm down your nervous system. Increase your emotional awareness. Articulate your emotions. Improve your sense of identity. Reconnect with your positive self. Deal with negative emotional dysregulation. Deal with that amygdalar pseudo-seizure-ness. If we fix all of these things, can we improve those DSO symptoms even if you don't have CPTSD? And that's really what I believe. Right? That's the running hypothesis. Because it's too similar. The clinical pictures are the overlap is so strong. I can't believe that the same regions of the brain are not active. And if the same regions of the brain are active, we can do the same stuff. And if it works for someone who has such a severe diagnosis of CPTSD, it should work for you. And what are we talking about here? We're talking about yoga. We're talking about meditation. We're talking about getting in touch with your emotions. We're talking about articulating your emotions. We're talking about developing a sense of self. We're talking about forming a narrative about your life. And that's what we see in this community, because we've been working on this crap for y'all. This is why I care so much about the trauma guide. Because the trauma guide is the guide for our community. And hopefully it makes sense to y'all now, like where I'm coming from. You don't need CPTSD. The right answer for CPTSD is medical treatment. But for all of us who have features of this, who don't have a diagnosis, we can still understand the basic neuroscience and address those things. Right? So the guide is not a substitute for clinical treatment. It is everything else. And that's what we're going to show you all today. So if you struggle with initiation, we're going to help y'all. Okay? 1 second. All right. So I can't watch this. I'm going to like literally step out of the room because I cannot handle myself, chat. This is just too much. So I'm going to turn this on. I'm going to turn this on. So we're going to watch an early cut, and then we're going to do Q&A when I get back, okay? Next up, we're going to talk about the paralysis of initiation. And a lot of people that I've worked with have struggled with this. This almost seems to be a societal phenomenon where people have trouble getting started. We know theoretically that there are other people out there who have goals, and they can wake up and they can sort of just do it. And then they also tell us, right? Like if you want to go to the gym, what you need to do is just do it. You just got to put yourself out there and just get started, because getting started is the hard part. But there's a large subset of people who struggle with just getting started. And as I explored this concept to try to help the patients that I was working with, I stumbled into the trauma literature. The original paper on complex PTSD uses this term paralysis of initiation. Now, complex PTSD is a little bit different from traditional PTSD, and we're going to dive into that for just a second. So in post-traumatic stress disorder, you usually have one or a short-term series of traumatic events that then traumatizes us. And then we develop a disorder, a psychiatric problem, as a result of the intensity of that singular trauma. On the other hand, there's a group of researchers who discovered something called complex PTSD, which is when the traumatic influence is persistent over time. So it's not a one-time thing, it's an environment that you grow up in. Or, once again, going back to the prisoners of war, these are prisoners who are in these camps for years and years and years. And what these researchers discovered is that when a trauma is repeated, that it messes up our ability to start our own actions. It seems to tamper with our very autonomy. And what they discovered in the prisoners was that these people became incredibly listless. Because if you kind of think about it, there's no point in getting anything started in a prison camp. There's nowhere to go, there are no goals to accomplish. It's all about survival. And what these researchers discovered is when these people got released from the prison camp, they still struggled to initiate things in their own lives. So we're going to dive into that concept in more detail because we've learned a lot about it since then. The first cause of paralysis of initiation is a loss of autonomy and a lack of reinforcement. So let's start with kind of a traditional household. Let's say a healthy household. So in this household, you have children that kind of grow up and they want to do things. They have desires. So they go to their parents and they say, hey, I want to go to the zoo today. And so the parent says, okay, fine, like I'll take you to the zoo. If the child has an impulse to start something or do something, that impulse gets reinforced. Another good example of this is, let's say I'm like painting a picture, I made something at school, and I come home and I show my parents, I say, hey, look at this picture I painted of the family. And my parents are very, very impressed and surprised with it. And what they do is they put it up on my fridge or they put it up on my wall. At some point, though, if you look at a healthy, normal household, as a child starts to initiate things, that initiation is supported and reinforced. If we look at something like a controlling household or an abusive household, the picture is very different. Because in a controlling household, what I want to do is completely irrelevant. It is what my parents want me to do that becomes important. So when I enter the 5th grade and I have a choice between learning this instrument or that instrument, which instrument I want to learn is not as important as which instrument my parents want me to learn. And so what we tend to see is that the behavioral impulses, anytime I try to start and do something, those aren't necessarily reinforced. And instead of autonomy, I'm sort of taught compliance. The same is true, but in a slightly different way when it comes to neglectful households. So in the same situation, if I come home with a picture that I painted of my family and my parents are absent, or there's a babysitter there, or for whatever 100 reasons that could possibly be going on,
Q&A.
something about my desires don't get reinforced in a neglectful household. Because as a child growing up, who is it that reinforces and supports your desires? It's your parents. And so even in the case of absent parents, we see a common thread of when I want to do something, the world around me doesn't necessarily help me do it. And in the worst case scenarios, what we actually see is that if I develop some sense of autonomy, I actually get punished for it. If I start to demonstrate initiative, which is one of the other things that we sort of see in the trauma literature, is that when we take initiative, some people will get punished for it. So I decided that I wanted to plan a birthday party this weekend with my friends, and I tell my parents about it on Thursday, but then they get really angry with me for not discussing it with them, not getting their permission. They're incredibly controlling. So all of my initiative kind of goes down the drain. It's all about what other people want. So this is the first cause of the paralysis of initiation, is if we look at the normal child development or normal human development, at some point our desires get reinforced, our autonomy gets rewarded. But if you grew up in an environment where your autonomy was not rewarded, where your desires were not reinforced, that is a lesson that your brain will carry forward. The second aspect of paralysis of initiation has to do with the loss of the future dimension. I know it sounds kind of weird and abstract, but it's actually pretty simple. So once again, as a child, let's look at the normal situation. So at some point, I start thinking about the future, right? If I have present and loving parents, they'll ask me, oh, what do you want for Christmas this year? Let's write Santa a letter. We're going to do something today that will be rewarded not just tomorrow, but a week from now, 2 weeks from now, 3 weeks from now. Similarly, supportive parents will take a look at your schedule for the week and sort of, even if you're in the 2nd grade or 3rd grade, they will sort of remind you or help you understand that, okay, this week you have these 2 assignments to complete, so we need to start thinking about tomorrow or even the end of the week today. So with healthy parenting, it's kind of bizarre, but we have this part of our brain that looks into the future and plans and executes tasks. This is the frontal lobe of our brain that kind of plans things out and makes sure they get done. In a normal household, this is a part of our brain that gets supported by our parents. But once again, once we move to a controlling or a neglectful household, that all goes out the window. So the first thing is planning for my future when I have controlling parents is a waste of time because my parents have decided what my future will be. In the worst case scenarios, like so for example, in my culture, there are some traditional Indian parents that will plan everything for their kids. You're gonna be a doctor, you're gonna be a lawyer. I had that conversation with my own dad when I was 9 years old. He said, we took me and my brother aside. I was 9, my brother was 12, and he said, one of y'all is gonna be a doctor and one of y'all is gonna be a lawyer. And then I ended up applying to med school, and people asked me, like, why do you wanna be a doctor? And I said, well, this is the conversation my dad had with me, and my brother was older, so he got to choose first, and he went to law school. So here I am. And we all had a good laugh about it, but I never really answered the question. The point, though, is that with controlling parents who sort of determine your future for you, they tell you what you need to accomplish, they tell you when you need to accomplish it. You're going to learn the cello, you're going to learn the violin, you're going to do a sport, you're going to do this, you're going to do that, or you're going to carry on in your father's footsteps and you're going to play football. Whatever the situation is, your sense of the future gets negatively impacted. You don't get to think about the future and plan for the future on your own. And the same is true in neglectful households, although once again, slightly differently. Because in this case, if you're a 7-year-old kid and your parents are absent, there's no point in planning for a slumber party in the future. And remember that as kids, we don't really know how to plan for the future ourselves. We actually need adults to teach us how to really use our frontal lobes. They sort of train us to do all of these things, in addition to like walking and talking and doing laundry, and all of these tasks that parents teach us are also affected in a neglectful household. So this is the second thing that happens, is that when we sort of think about the future dimension, in a healthy household, thinking about the future dimension is rewarded. If I make a Christmas list for Santa, I actually get those presents. If I plan for a slumber party this weekend, the slumber party actually happens. But in the case of controlling, abusive, or neglectful households, this planning for the future does not get reinforced. Sometimes it just becomes neglected so that I don't get rewarded for thinking about the future. But in the harshest cases, I actually get punished. So since I have all these plans of I want this for Christmas or I want my friends to come over this weekend, but when Friday rolls around, my parent has been drinking and they don't feel like having kids in the house, so they tell me to call all my friends and cancel at the last minute. And then I'm left with disappointing all of my friends. And so in the most drastic cases, we actually get punished for thinking about the future. And this is the problem in each of these scenarios, is that over time, in the simplest case, these parts of our brain are not reinforced. We don't have behavioral reinforcement of desire. We don't have positive reinforcement for planning of the future. And in the worst cases, we actually get punished for doing these things. Because if you kind of think about it, let's say I have a desire, and then since my parents are neglectful, I make this Christmas list, but then no presents show up on Christmas Day. What is the lesson I learn as a child? Over time, the lesson I'll learn is it's better not to have desires in the first place, because then I won't be disappointed. So it's better to just not want anything at all. It's better to not try to do anything. It's better to put forth no effort whatsoever, because at the end of the day, I'm living my life reactively. I have no sense of autonomy or control. And if I try to exert control, if I am stupid enough to want things, then that will actually hurt and lead to disappointment. And then you learn a very dangerous lesson, which is wanting things and thinking about the future is painful and harmful. And once you learn this lesson, this leads to the paralysis of initiation later in life. Now, there's another challenge that we kind of run into that keeps people who grow up in these kinds of environments from really initiating things, and that is a reliance on perfectionism. So there's a group of people that I've worked with, and this group, by the way, is becoming increasingly common because, once again, a lot of people grow up in scenarios like this, where they can't get started until it's perfect. So I'm not going to apply to college unless I know I can get into Harvard. I'm not going to take this course unless I know I can get an A. I'm not going to even learn any skill until I practice ahead of time, even before I join the course. So if I'm learning how to dance, I'm going to spend 3 months practicing at home so I don't embarrass myself when I join the class that is even for novices. So there are a lot of people out there that are very hesitant to get started until things are perfect. And let's explore a little bit about why this happens. So this too can be tracked back to trauma. So if we sort of think about controlling, abusive, or neglectful households, these households create situations that are very stressful and dangerous for the child. So in order to understand why some people become very perfectionistic and why some people can afford to take risks, we have to understand a very important divergence that happens very early in life. So let's start with the case of a healthy household. So if we sort of think about it, the world is objectively a dangerous place for kids. So if I'm like, let's say an 18-month-old kid, 1-year-old kid, 2-year-old kid, the world is a dangerous place. I can barely walk. I tend to stumble a lot. Things like stairs can be incredibly dangerous. But it's not just that. It's also things like when I get served food, does the food burn me or not? And this is where parents come in, because parents who are very attentive will protect the child from the dangerous world.
And this is like kind of what we know. If you're a parent, you'll understand this, that your children will try all kinds of things to hurt themselves because they don't really know that the world is a dangerous place. And the better you take care of them, the more reckless they become because there are never negative consequences for things. A parent who's always caught when they jump off the bed will not learn the danger of gravity. So these children become very secure in the world around them because it's a safe place, because mom or dad is there to protect me from danger. So these children become more confident, they're able to embrace more risks, they can try new things, and they also enjoy exploring the world. They're very, very confident that someone is out there protecting them. They're not really aware that there's a person out there protecting them. They just know that as they stumble around, someone's always catching them and they don't get hurt. On the flip side, let's look at something like a neglectful household. So in this case, now the world becomes a dangerous place because there isn't a parent paying attention if I slip and fall. No one is even watching as I start climbing up the stairs, and on my 7th stair, since I'm like a 13-month-old kid, I stumble and fall, and then I roll down the stairs and start crying. In the worst case scenarios, even when I start crying, either the parent doesn't pay attention, doesn't care, or even will get mad at me for crying and will tell me to be quiet. So if we see households that are incredibly controlling, which also can be sort of scary for a child, because in a controlling household with very demanding parents, we want our children to be perfect, right? Don't spill, don't play with this, you made a mess, this happened, this happened, this happened. So very controlling parents will be very angry with their children for not being perfect. Abusive households also lead to a reliance on perfectionism, because usually what the child learns when it comes to abuse is there is a magical formula to avoid the abuse. If the child can be kind enough, if the child can be sweet enough, if the child can be cute enough or pretty enough, demure enough, invisible enough, sometimes these children can sort of figure out, almost from a survival mechanism, that if I have an abusive parent, there are some days that the parent is not abusive. And so then the child naturally tries to figure out what is the difference between the abusive day and the non-abusive day. And this is when they start to develop this idea that if I'm a perfect child, then I will be safe. And so perfectionism and safety go hand in hand. So if you try to do something in the outside world and you are not perfect, remember that this stuff gets baked in to your upbringing in the same way that you were understanding how strong gravity is, or what the sun feels like, or how many fingers you have. This stuff gets really baked in, and perfectionism and safety become one and the same. So this is another reason why people struggle with initiating tasks. They can be very, very afraid of doing something wrong. They can't afford to make mistakes, and they need to be perfect before they get started. And why is this? It's because the world that they see does not allow them to make mistakes. If they make some kind of slip up, and if they screw up in some kind of way, the world is a fundamentally dangerous, scary, and punishing place. And if we are wired in any one of these three ways, if our desires and our autonomy has not been reinforced, if our capacity to plan for the future has actually been squashed or neglected, or we grew up in an environment where we had to be perfect before we get started, all three of these can result in the paralysis of initiation.
Alrighty. So, all right, hold on a second. Yeah, so that's one of the videos from the trauma guide. And like I said, like we've been working on this for a while, and when I was making the trauma guide, y'all can hear me, right? Am I muted? Okay, no, y'all can hear me. You know, I was thinking about like us and like what are the things that we struggle with. And it's not, and there's absolutely like clinically significant stuff. And I was also thinking about like, you know, if I could take all of my patients who have diagnoses of some kind of trauma or a history of trauma, and I could like give them a workshop for not the stuff that we do in the office, like nothing about, I mean, there's stuff about medication and treatment and stuff like that too, but like not that stuff, but like all the other dimensions of their life. Like how do you find a relationship when you have a history of trauma? How do you reconnect with yourself? And these are the kinds of things that like, you know, are not specific to a person. This is the common stuff that I would teach to my patients. which isn't technically like a part of their diagnosis. I mean, it's part of their diagnosis, I guess, but it's like, I don't know how to describe it. It's not, it's not about this relationship that this person has. It's about the principle of why is it hard for this group of people to form relationships. Okay. Yeah, so let's do some Q&A. So we've got we wanted to save some time for Q&A. So I know we've like run long and we're at like 2:30 and we started late, but let's do Q&A for about 15 minutes. Can you answer super chat questions? I don't know. I don't know how to do that. Okay, so there's one question here. Since trauma is the great chameleon, what is your opinion on when you disagree with your therapist about your presentation? Belief in oneself is important for recovery, yet they're a professional. Okay, I'm going to ask if we have mods, if y'all saw good questions, if anyone was keeping track, can y'all let me know via, some method of communication? Just let me know. Okay, so what if you disagree with your therapist? This is a great question. So how do you go about if your therapist disagrees, or if you disagree with your therapist about your diagnosis or the formulation, like what do you do about that, right? They're the one with the degree, but you're the one who's living the life. So this is where I'd say disagreement in therapy is like not something to be avoided. The whole point of therapy is that we don't know what the right answer is when we get started. And finding the right answer is a series of like recalibrating after overshooting or moving in the wrong direction. Like that's what therapy is. So your therapist doesn't magically know what's going on with you. We have the first layer of information, and then we make some conclusions. And then we have the second layer of information. We whittle away some of the conclusions. And then over time, we want to kind of like ping pong our way like to what the right answer is. That's been my experience as a psychiatrist. So if you disagree with your therapist, I think first of all, that's totally fine. Secondly, I would ask the therapist to explain why they believe what they believe. So walk me through your reasoning. And then what you want to offer is your own reasoning. So let me understand why you have your opinion. Let me now explain to you why I think that's good or not good, or what my perspective is. And chances are neither of you is going to be 100% right. And then the question is, what can your therapist take away from your explanation that moves you closer to the right answer? And what can you take away from your therapist's answer that moves you closer to the right answer? Now, a lot of therapists, myself included, find that having a patient understand what's truly going on is not going to happen fast. So I oftentimes find that when I explain things to patients or when I offer a formulation at the very beginning, they will sometimes very strongly disagree with something that I'm very confident in. And usually over time, we get there, right? Because you have to remember that as a patient, you have more information about your life, but you're not as objective. So that's where it's like, and medical doctors, therapists, psychiatrists, we get diagnoses like wrong all the time. So there's all kinds of stuff that we get wrong. So I think it's more about the process than it is about like being right or wrong. So try to really understand where they're coming from. And I try to take that to heart, right? Really try to be open-minded and try to see if you can understand, okay, how, even though I instinctively react to this being incorrect, there's a possibility that if I change my thinking in some ways, this could be correct. So let me try to do that, right? So the last thing I'd kind of say is steel man instead of straw man their argument. I mean, it shouldn't be an argument, but do your best to alter your assumptions to see if you can understand where they're coming from. Good question. Okay. Now let's go to, there we go. Okay. Questions. Trauma Guide, I think, comes out at the end of the month. Okay. C-PTSD and ADHD, there seems to be a lot of overlap. How do you tell the difference between the two if you have both? I think you mentioned in another video something about how all kids with ADHD end up with some trauma. If that's true, how do we know what comes from ADHD versus what comes from C-PTSD? It's a great question. So if you've got ADHD and trauma, how do you know what's what? So there are a couple of different things to keep in mind. The first thing that we have to remember is that psychiatric diagnoses are not real things. They are abstractions or human concepts to try to understand reality. So like when I say someone has major depressive disorder, there's absolutely some kind of biological mechanism, but human beings made up the idea of major depressive disorder. What psychiatric diagnosis really is a bunch of human beings observe real things in other human beings. And then we try to come up with a language that unifies what we see in individuals. And that's really what a psychiatric diagnosis is. So how can you tell the difference between what's ADHD and what's PTSD or C-PTSD? So both of these can result in impairment in concentration or attention. Both of them can result in impulsivity. Both of them can result in emotional dysregulation. How can we tell the difference? So a lot of what we know about ADHD is from a neurodiverse perspective. We know that their brains develop in a slightly different way. So we know that people with ADHD have their frontal lobes have less control over their impulses and their emotions. So people with ADHD are more likely to get emotionally dysregulated, and we can track that back to the connections in their brain. So our frontal lobes are the brakes, and they can control and rein in other parts of our brain. But people with ADHD have brakes that seem to be weaker. And there's some kind of genetic component to this, some kind of the way that your brain is wired. Now, things get complicated because growing up in a neurotypical society as someone who is neurodiverse results in usually some level of trauma. So if you look at comorbid ADHD and major depressive disorder, what you find is 3% of people who have major depressive disorder will grow up to have ADHD, but 70% of people who have ADHD will grow up to have major depressive disorder. This is within a comorbid population. So there is absolutely a causative impact of ADHD on depression. And the reason for that is because when you're neurodiverse and people just tell you to try harder, but your brain can't do that, you start to believe something is wrong with you. You don't have as much self-esteem. People don't, since you cut in line, you don't get invited to birthday parties. You have fewer friends because you can't wait your turn. And all of these, there's consequences of untreated ADHD that will end up traumatizing. So at that point, we've kind of got both. Now, this also gets confusing because there are a lot of features of PTSD like emotional dysregulation, difficulty concentrating. So how can you tell the difference? So there are a couple of different things to keep in mind. The first is that it's not so important to really tease it out because many of the things that we will do to fix one, we would do to fix the other anyway. So a simple example is meditation, right? So meditation is a useful treatment for PTSD, C-PTSD, borderline personality disorder, and ADHD. There are some specifics about the kind of meditation which you kind of need to understand, but generally speaking, the treatment is going to be the same. Dealing with shame, whether it comes from ADHD or PTSD, is going to be not the same, but it's in the same ballpark. Let's put it that way. So the treatments for the two will overlap quite a bit. The third thing is emotional dysregulation. That needs to be improved in both, right? So this is where the first thing to keep in mind is it is not necessary to perfectly tease these two apart before we intervene. and this is something that we learn in clinical medicine, right? So when you become a psychiatrist, you learn this. If you're not sure what the diagnosis is, lean into a treatment that treats both options. So SSRIs, does this person have a anxious depression, or do they have an anxiety disorder with an adjustment disorder laid on top? Who knows? In either case, SSRIs will treat both. So if we're going to start with something, let's start with an SSRI. So the treatments can overlap. Now, there are a couple of places where the treatments don't overlap. So for example, things like stimulant medication. And that's where it is important. So we can do things like neuropsychological testing, right? We can offer formal testing to detect the deficits of ADHD. We can also offer diagnostic scales of trauma and things like that. And so we can tease things apart in some way. But I'd say that practically, I've treated a lot of people where we're not sure what is causing what. And that's where as a clinician, what we do is, okay, so if I think your diagnoses are ADHD and PTSD, we can start someone on stimulant medication. And then we see, right, what part of this does this fix? So if more of it is trauma-oriented, we would not expect ADHD medication to be that effective at improving things. So over time, it's like a process, right? And that's why we really emphasize that you should work with a clinician. The advantage of working with a clinician is that they will collect more information over time and you will refine your diagnosis. And you absolutely could have both. Great question. Okay. Next. Okay, I'm going to see a therapist for the first time soon. Do you have any advice? It's hard for me to open up and talk about myself or how I feel emotionally. So here's my advice if you're going to a therapist for the first time. So remember that the therapist has a job, and their job is to do their job. So you don't need to be great at opening up. You don't have to talk about yourself emotionally. It is their job to make you feel comfortable enough to where you open up whether you kind of want to or not. Second thing to keep in mind is that success in therapy is a skill. So the first time that you go ice skating, I wouldn't expect you to know how to ice skate. In the same way, going to therapy is something that you will get better at over time. So there are some patients that I've worked with where one of the things that I'll put in their formulation and something that I'll let them know is that I think you utilize therapy very well, right? So people will get better at it. So my advice would be the most important part is showing up, and then follow their lead and let them know what you're looking for. Let them know what works for you and what doesn't work for you. It's totally fine to even tell them, hey, I have difficulty opening up and talking about my emotions. That's totally fair game, right? So that's their job to help you get better at that. Okay. What tactic would you take to heal C-PTSD mixed with moral injury from a specific event? I'm confused about what moral injury from a specific event is. What's the relationship between C-PTSD, addiction, and sense of worthlessness? So let's talk about that. So the first thing to understand about trauma and addiction is that addiction is not a problem, it is a solution. So human beings get addicted to things for a couple of reasons. So you can absolutely make a genetic argument where there's a very strong, vulnerability, and once you get a taste, like the first drop of alcohol, and you're hooked. I've absolutely seen that. But for a lot of people, addictions are solutions before they become problems. So addictions give pleasure and take away pain. And the problem with C-PTSD is that, remember, we have emotional dysregulation. We have difficulty. So there's two ways that people with trauma have difficulty with their emotions. The first is that they're negative emotions in the more primitive parts of their brain. This is places like the amygdala. These are the parts of our brain that experience fear, anxiety, things like that. Those are very itchy. They've got itchy trigger fingers, so they can trigger very easily and very intensely. That's the first emotional deficit. Second emotional problem that people with trauma have is that their sense of self oftentimes carries with it a lot of shame and guilt and stuff like that. So this isn't like fear of the outside world. This is a persistent emotional negative state that I carry with me. That's actually a different part of the brain. It relates more to the default mode network. These are emotions that are called social cognitive emotions. So we have two types of emotions. We have our primitive emotions like anger and fear that even reptiles experience. And then we have a different part of our brain that has our social cognitive emotions: pride, guilt, shame. You can't have those emotions without a social component. I feel proud when people look at me. I feel ashamed when people look at me. It requires socialization. So the people with PTSD have difficulty with that as well. The third thing that people with PTSD struggle with is feeling positive emotions. These come from a completely different region of the brain, the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex. So this is stuff like excitement, love, curiosity. People with trauma feel kind of like numbed out, right? So it's kind of like the real tragedy is you feel numbed out in terms of positivity, but you've got a very itchy brain and it's easy to activate some of these negative emotions. So where does addiction come in? Addiction fixes all three, right? So if we look at things like benzodiazepines, these are treatments for anxiety. And we developed benzodiazepines by recognizing that alcohol alleviates people's anxiety. So we developed a pill that basically activates the same receptor as alcohol, kind of chills you out, right? So we know we can treat anxiety with certain psychoactive substances. Next thing that psychoactive substances do is they will numb us, right? So this is also through the GABA receptor like alcohol, but there are other ways that they will sort of make us forget ourselves. That critical self-dialogue that is always running in our head goes away when we get high, for example. So they alleviate our negative emotions. The third thing that they help us do is feel positive emotions. So it's easier to feel like we're having a good time, we're vibing, we're relaxing, we're chilling, we're partying. Things like MDMA or ecstasy can help us feel connected to other people, right? So if we really look at it, the reason that trauma and drugs overlap so heavily is because drugs and addictions fix the problems of trauma, but only temporarily. So we'll also see this with things like people who have a history of trauma and have diagnoses of borderline personality disorder will engage with things like promiscuous behavior, intense, unstable relationships to help feel loved, right? Because when I'm head over heels in love with someone, I can feel better about myself. So we see that if we look at the neuroscience of emotional challenges with PTSD, we see that addictions actually like fix all three of those. So there's a very high overlap. The problem is that the fix from an addiction is temporary and over time will get objectively worse. Great question. Okay. How would you heal trauma from having been in an incubator for a long time as a baby? I have no clue. I mean, that's really interesting. There's a lot of like interesting data about, you know, perinatal and post-birth like stuff and correlations with things like learning disabilities and stuff like that. I don't think I've ever seen a clinical case where like we thought that the trauma originated at the level of an incubator, but it's a very interesting question. I'm not saying it can't have an impact. Really interesting question. I don't have an answer to that one. Okay. Is there a significant difference between someone who developed C-PTSD because of one of those three household styles versus someone who developed C-PTSD from a combination? Especially if all three situations are, yeah. So I think the answer is basically yes. So here's the thing to understand about trauma. So what we know about trauma is that trauma shapes you. And we know that the way that it shapes you causes problems later in life. That's how we define trauma. So negative events shape us all the time, But if it doesn't cause a negative impact, we don't diagnose someone with like PTSD. So there's research on things like post-traumatic growth where you can go through something traumatic and you can end up positive. Now, this is why I think the treatment of trauma is fun, right? So like I find it clinically enjoyable. I know it's kind of weird to say, but like I find it intellectually engaging. I find I have a lot of compassion. I find a lot of like growth, and it gives me like positivity to see people overcome their trauma. So I find the experience to be very like enjoyable, gratifying. And what we know is that the way in which you're busted will shape the way you're busted, right? So like if you have a combination of different traumatic things, that can result in like something new or something different, or a combination of the above. Now, I don't know that one is necessarily worse than the other, but we absolutely see like nuances of each of these manifestations, and that's very common. And so then it's just an issue of like seeing which manifestation is common when. So like learning to think about the future again, like we want to do that. And we want to learn how to like reward our autonomy. Like we can do all of the above. It's not either or. So what if I don't have the safety to want to calm down? I wouldn't be as safe anymore if I were calm. So that's a very common experience of people who have been traumatized. So if you look at research on trauma, what we find is that the most important thing for healing trauma is safety. So we don't talk about this much as clinicians when we lecture about trauma, but basically we know that like physical safety, and even to a certain degree emotional safety, is very, very important. So the first step to treating any trauma is not emotions or anything like that, is actually physical safety. That's number one. And the reason for that is very simple. If you're not physically safe, your hypothalamus will be pumping out something called CRH. CRH is corticotropin releasing hormone. The CRH will go to your pituitary glands and will release ACTH. So your pituitary will pump out ACTH, which will cause your adrenal cortices to pump out cortisol. As long as you have cortisol and other kinds of sympathetic nervous system or stress hormones floating through your system, you cannot rewire and you cannot heal. Like physiologically, it is very difficult to do. So if we look at the role of these stress hormones aren't about picking up the pieces. They're about surviving and getting through the day. So what you find in people who have an experience of trauma, who don't feel safe and aren't safe, is that it is very hard to work on the trauma because their brain is not in a neuroplastic state. So let's understand this, okay? So our brain develops or becomes increasingly neuroplastic when we sleep. So if we look at like memory consolidation, we have short-term memory and we have long-term memory. Our short-term memory, which is kind of like our RAM, gets rewritten into our long-term memory, which is kind of like our hard drive, when we sleep. So we do this process of memory consolidation. This involves a lot of neuroplasticity because we're forming new memories. Now, if we look at sleep, stress hormones impede sleep. So sleep is when we build a lot of tissues and grow a lot of neurons. I mean, we don't grow too many neurons, but BDNF increases, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, I think increases in sleep as well. So our brain rewires when we sleep. When we're stressed out, it runs against the sleeping signals. So we have these pro-sleep states where our brain does things like rewire, heal, and learn. And then we have these anti-sleep states, which is like survive, stay awake, and survive. And so we absolutely need safety as part of the healing process. So I think the first step to healing trauma is creating safety. Now that becomes a little bit tricky because sometimes because of the nature of our hyperarousal and the way our nervous system is wired, the lack of safety is not quite as external as we think it is. I'm not saying it isn't. I mean, there are people who are in abusive households where it's unsafe objectively. But the tricky thing about trauma is that we carry that lack of safety within us. So there's a balance between creating external safety And even when you create external safety, it's not like internally you'll feel safe right away. So there's a process of letting yourself rewire to feeling safe as well. Great question. We're going to take one more. When I was born, I was left crying for 2 hours in an incubator before someone held me and took me to my mother. I blame my constant anxiety for this. So that level of specificity, I don't really have much comment on. I would feel very, very surprised to learn that that singular event is responsible for a persistent adult condition. Would be very surprised. So the other thing that we know is that isolated events in childhood, kids are quite resilient. So the cool thing about kids is that even if they go through a traumatic experience, it is very common for them to bounce back. And that's because kids their brain is very neuroplastic. Even their body is quite changeable, right? So kids their neurons can still grow in ways that adults can't. They can create new neurons. Most of what happens is pruning, but their healing capacity is way bigger because they're not in read-only mode. They're still in write mode, so that a lot of them children can heal very easily. So I'd be surprised. I'm not saying it's not possible, and that's something to work through with a clinician. Interesting. Thank you for sharing. Do we know if EMDR is effective for C-PTSD? I personally think it is, but there's a lot of controversy around EMDR. And we don't have many studies on what's effective for C-PTSD. So my problem has been so good at masking my C-PTSD that they don't find the issue. Any tips as to opening up? Yeah, I'd start with the body. Right? That's why we kind of talked about that. So I don't know if this kind of makes sense, but the way that we've outlined our approach to trauma, and especially in the guide, the reason it's built that way is because we have gotten these questions over and over and over. And I have this problem. I have this problem. I have this problem. I have this problem. What about this? 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 So what we did is took all those questions and say, okay, if we take all of these questions, how can we understand trauma that accounts for all of these? So why do we have a video about paralysis of initiation and impulsivity? Because we recognize that there's an overlap between the symptomatology of ADHD and trauma. We recognize that people with trauma have difficulties that feel like ADHD. So that's in there. We recognize that people have difficulty opening up. We recognize that people have difficulty feeling their emotions. That's why we start with the body. Right? And that's why relationships is at the very end. So start with the body. Okay. How do I bring up C-PTSD up to my therapist? I resonated with this topic a lot, but I feel like it's not my place to initiate the conversation. There it is, right? So I can say, it's absolutely your place to initiate the conversation. That's your job. That's why you're going, right? You're going for your benefit, not the therapist's benefit. If it helps you, by all means, bring it up. That doesn't work, though, right? So one of the manifestations of C-PTSD is you feel like it's not your place. You feel like deferring to the other person. You feel like following someone else's lead. See, when we don't have a well-formed sense of identity, we don't feel like we deserve very much. It's not my place. When it's absolutely your place, that's the definition of your place. The reason the therapy is the one place where you get to go for you and for no one else. So whatever you want is fair game. Right? I mean, within reason. It's the therapist can say no. But it's very common. So notice that. Notice that your desire to not even bring it up, or your feeling that it's not my place to bring it up, could be a manifestation of the very problem itself. And just notice that. And then try your best to bring it up. Right? You can even share. So one last technique that I'll give y'all is if you're having, so this is like pro technique in therapy, okay? So sometimes we feel embarrassed bringing something up because there's a lot of emotional energy here. There's shame, there's guilt, there's like, oh my God, this kind of kinky thing kind of turns me on. And like, oh my God, I have these kind of thoughts. And so we have difficulty like tackling that emotion and being vulnerable. So instead, what I want y'all to do is go one layer above it. So what you can say to your therapist is, there's something that I feel ashamed of that I don't feel comfortable bringing up with you. So you go meta, right? So you're not bringing up the thing, you're saying, this thing is hard for me. And then even if that's too hard, you can go one level above. I want to bring something up with you. I want to bring up that I'm scared to talk about something. But even that's hard to talk about. So what we want to do is move away from the emotion and put that out there, right? Say like even one step removed. You don't have to talk about the shameful thing. There's something that I'm ashamed of that I don't want to talk about. You can just say that. And then it's the therapist's job to take over. Like that's what we're good at, right? That's what we're trained for. We're trained to help you do that. And even when we're like, so there's a good technique in therapy called going meta, right? So, and that's when there's something like, so if someone says like, hey, I'm here for therapy. I want to focus on this, but I don't want to talk about this. And so what do we do in therapy? We don't say, okay, screw you. We're going to talk about that anyway because you don't want to talk about it. No, what we do is help me understand why you don't want to talk about it. Totally fine. We don't have to talk about it. Just, can you give me a little bit of context? Cool. And then you can bring it up later. So then it's your therapist's job to get there if you want to talk about it. You can say, hey, I want to talk about this thing, but I'm too embarrassed and I'm going to shut down. Okay. How do I explain my C-PTSD to a family member that has expressed that she wants to help but doesn't really understand the gravity of my issues? Honestly, like I'd send them this video. Right? So one thing that's starting to happen is that people are starting to share some of our content, like not for themselves, but like they're like, you know, we had this video about autism and gender identity. We had a video about relationships with BPD, with people with borderline personality disorder. And so we're seeing a lot of like sharing going on. So, you know, a lot of people struggle to convey what we convey. Don't convey it. Just share. And like, I don't know if y'all get this. I cannot remember the last time. I know that like all content creators are like, hey, if you like the video, like, subscribe, and share. I can't remember the last time. I mean, I've done it before, right? So maybe on like why men, the male suicide or why therapy sucks for men. There are a couple of videos that we've done, lectures we've done, streams that we've done, where I've asked y'all to share things. I don't ask y'all to share things. Like, you know, sure, it helps us, but like we're not here for us. We're here for you. And that's why I don't ask y'all to like, subscribe, or share. The only time I ask y'all to do it is when I think it benefits you or someone else who may need help. So this is one of the rare times where I would say the whole reason we do this and we store these is so that y'all can share it with other people. So like if you don't know, like if like, let's say you watch a video about BPD and you realize, holy crap, I could have BPD. This is what it's like to be in my shoes. I think you should absolutely share that with someone who you're in a relationship with. And be like, this person kind of explains what my experience is like in a way that I can't quite explain it. Right? Or something about addiction or whatever. Like if you're a gifted kid and your parents tell you that you have all the potential in the world and if you just tried harder, send them our Gifted Kids as special needs video. Right? So we're here as a resource for your benefit. That does not just mean you're the only one that has to watch us. So if we explain a concept in a way that it would be useful for someone in your life to understand, then you should share our videos. But once again, that's not so that we can increase our views by 0.01%. That is because it benefits you. That's why you should share. Or if it benefits someone else. Make sense? Would you consider Spanish subtitles? I think we're working on it. Oh, what a beautiful question. So we're at time for the day, but I'm going to leave you all with one last question that I love. There's two questions. Man, these are so best meditation for trauma. We're past time, so I don't have time or energy to do meditation today, for which I apologize. But in the trauma guide, we've got, hold on a second. Let me tell y'all. We have a whole new stock of meditations. Oh, here, oh, damn it. I just realized that people are telling me. These are so good. Okay. We're going to answer one question, then we're going to try to speed run a couple more. So, first thing is, what was I talking about? I don't even remember. Brain death is setting in. Oh, meditations. So we have a bunch of meditations. Let me count. So we have I think about 10 meditations. Okay, no, one is an overview. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There's 11 meditations in the trauma guide. So definitely check those out. I think they're great. They'll build on the existing meditations that we've taught y'all. And I just ran into, will trauma ever go away? Quick answer to that one. Possibly, actually. So we know that like a lot of people will heal from trauma without any overt intervention. So the cool thing is, like, if you look at the body, like the body and brain, like, heal. That's what we're designed to do. So the short answer is it's very possible that you don't need to do a damn thing and it'll fix itself, or your relationships will organically fix it. I wouldn't adopt that strategy, though. There's another question of how do we address the sources of trauma out in the world and who is responsible for doing so? That's a lovely question. I love it, love it, love it, love it, love it. It's way beyond the scope of what we have time for today. So I think this is actually, that's in the guide. What am I saying? So I was going to say, so we can absolutely talk about it. But I think talking about karma is a very good exploration of this topic. So over on the membership side, we had a couple of great karma lectures. We talk about karma in the trauma guide because there is this whole idea of, like, you know, everything we're talking about is fixing you, but what about the outside world? So I think it's a very important discussion, but I don't think it's a short answer. I think it's like if we're going to talk about it, let's talk about it. Okay, so can you recommend specific meditation techniques? There's about 10 of them in the guide, which, by the way, is why we built a guide, right? Because, like, I don't know if this makes sense, but there's no way we can get to even 1% of the questions that y'all ask, or even share with y'all 1% of, like, the meditations that y'all can try and things like that. That's why we build these stock resources that are way more in depth. I don't know if this kind of makes sense, but, you know, filming of the trauma guide is like, the filming is a week of me showing up at a studio at like 8 o'clock and leaving at 5. And cameras are rolling for like 9 hours a day for like 5 to 7 days. And so it's like, you know, like, in order to duplicate that, I would have to stream for like 50 hours in a week. So I just can't do that. Like, my voice cannot handle it. So that's why we build these resources, because there's just no way we can get to everything. But it's very, like, and the reason we edit and everything is so that, like, it's very high yield. So how do you start to build your own sense of self? I think it's, first of all, cleaning out negative emotions and then starting to string together emotional experiences into a new narrative. There's a whole video about narrative and identity, and constructing a positive narrative is something that can be taught. It is a skill, and it is something that has been shown to improve outcomes in trauma. So like narrative is an important part. Absolutely. So there's just a way to do it. How to not be one of the 69% to resist trauma treatment. Great question. So remember that those people are not resistant to trauma treatment. They are resistant to a particular intervention for a particular diagnosis. And we know the cause for that resistance is a high level of dissociation. We have other things that improve dissociation. So there's a certain model of trauma treatment called STARE. And the whole model is based on first you do this, then you do this, then you do this, then you do this. And when you do it that way, that's like a comprehensive approach that checks most of the boxes and deals with this concept of resistant to trauma treatment. Is C-PTSD curable, or do you have to deal with it for the rest of your life? I personally believe that for, I would say, most people, it is basically curable. I know it's a bold statement. I may be dumb. I may be wrong. But I personally believe that trauma for most people can be cured. I do not believe that for schizophrenia. So I think we know that some of our psychiatric diagnoses are like progressive and more biologically driven. So schizophrenia is a really good example of that one. But like trauma is different. I've seen people basically be in complete remission or cure from C-PTSD before. I'm 50 and never felt happy. How long into treatment for PTSD will I be before I can start to feel? The short answer is I don't know. So the other thing about trauma treatment is that your mileage may vary. So if we look at most treatments, they tend to be effective somewhere around the 8-week mark. And you'll have some gains up until about the 16-week mark. And then beyond that, you can absolutely have gains. But generally speaking, it takes 2 to 4 months for treatments to start to be effective. That being said, feeling happy. Let me actually pull up a paper. Feeling happy is not necessarily one of the things that we look at in trauma treatment, right? So we'll like measure some things, but we don't necessarily look at happiness. So like this is the kind of thing where, you know, the short answer is your mileage may vary. The slightly longer answer, which is super cool, is complex post-traumatic stress disorder is an independent diagnosis, differences in hedonic and eudaimonic well-being between C-PTSD and PTSD. I imagine that the answer to your question is somewhere in this paper. So what this paper talks about is that there are 2 kinds of happiness. There is dopaminergic happiness and there is serotonergic happiness. Dopaminergic happiness is what we call hedonism, hedonic well-being. So this is like my ability to experience pleasure. Eudaimonic happiness is a sense of contentment, peace, or internal happiness that is not tied to a particular thing. So if I like go on a roller coaster, that will increase my hedonic happiness. Playing a video game will increase my hedonic happiness. Watching pornography will increase my hedonic happiness because it gives me pleasure. But especially with things like video games and pornography, it can decrease my eudaimonic happiness. So this is my sense of like peace and joy in life. Unfortunately, C-PTSD is associated with impairments in both and less of both. So what we do know is that if you get treated for this stuff, both of those indices will improve. And what we also know is that in C-PTSD, eudaimonic unhappiness is more profound than hedonic unhappiness. So if you have a history of trauma, your ability to engage in pleasure is modulated or impaired, but your ability to feel at peace and feel joy in life is even more impaired. So the pleasure circuitry is somewhat intact. The sense of peace circuitry is more screwed up. So let's just kind of take a quick look at, I think I remember that correctly. See, these findings indicate that core symptoms of C-PTSD might hinder individuals from living fulfilling lives. That's what eudaimonic happiness is. Okay? It's bizarre. So if you guys are wondering, so like putting together this deep dive, first thing is, for every hour that I spend telling y'all about something, there's 4 hours of stuff that I leave out. And this is why I like doing such a deep dive, because it's like cool, because if y'all ask a question, it turns out there's literally at least one paper that talks about happiness and trauma. Right? So there's good news and bad news here. The short answer is, how long will it take you to feel happy? I would say give it at least 6 months. But there are also other caveats there, right? Because whether you feel happy or not can be somewhat independent of your treatment. So I had a patient who once came in and I treated them for major depressive disorder. And after about 2 years, they said, I don't feel like I've gotten any better. And I was like, well, what do you mean by that? Because your life has improved. We've talked about all the things that have improved. And he's like, I still feel depressed every day. And after tunneling down into it, that's when we realized this isn't depression. This is unhappiness. And the presence of depression is different from the absence of unhappiness. These are two separate things. The treatment of depression moves us towards neutral. Learning to be happy is its own separate path. This is oftentimes more along the spiritual line as opposed to the clinical line. And in trauma, that can be true as well. And so if someone hasn't felt happy, we absolutely know that things like the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex are impaired in C-PTSD, which prevents people or makes it difficult for them to feel positive emotions. Instead, they feel numbness. When they go to a birthday party for them, when they go to their birthday party, everyone is happy and celebrating, and you're just like, I don't feel anything. Like, it's not bad, but I don't feel joy. And that's where there is, so treating C-PTSD will help with eudaimonic well-being. Absolutely. But part of that treatment is a little bit more spiritual, and you can do that on your own, right? So you can learn to appreciate. You can start practicing gratitude. There are other ways to engage, to increase your happiness that don't have to do so much with C-PTSD. Now, I suspect some of these techniques will be difficult for people with C-PTSD because the parts of their brain that normally these techniques would activate may somehow be impaired. So I recently did a lecture on the neuroscience of enlightenment, and that may be showing up on one of our channels soon. Maybe, maybe not. I'm not sure. But the short answer is your mileage may vary. It is a very good question. There's a lot at play between trauma and happiness and fulfillment. Treatment will help. But even if it doesn't help, don't give up. I guess that's what I mean to say. That the treatment of an illness is not the same as creating happiness in your life. And sometimes that is an independent process. And on that note, we're at time for the day. Way past time. So it's been an absolute pleasure to be here today with y'all. Let me think about... I just want to show y'all a couple of things before we close out. So for those of y'all that are joining us late, we do have a trauma guide that is going to be coming out soon that is available for pre-order. I know we discussed a lot of dense neuroscience today, so we're also improving things in that dimension. So here we have some of the trauma guide graphics. Right, so some of these complicated neuroscience things that we teach y'all, we absolutely want to teach y'all. Like, we try to make it accessible, but we're not dumbing it down. And I think that the more that y'all understand the difference between dorsomedial prefrontal cortex emotions and amygdala emotions, the more in control of your life you'll be. And in order to facilitate that understanding, we have a lot of cool stuff coming down the pipeline. The trauma guide is made with a lot of love, so definitely check it out. Thank y'all very much for coming here today. And then, take care of yourselves. Like, don't give up. It's not over. Like, the reason it's reasonable to want to give up because you can try really hard and things don't improve makes a lot of sense. I hear that. But it doesn't mean, just because things have not improved does not mean that things are impossible. So take care, y'all. Happy weekend.